Nice. So is the camera on me yet?
No, it's still on the...
Cool.
So we'll just do this for a minute.
Oh, okay. Then you'll let me know. Just give me a thumbs up when it's like... Oh, okay.
So you can say
What's up, audience?
Nice.
Can you hear me? Welcome to America's #1 Chadcast worldwide.
Sounds coming through. So, as soon as you see yourself. You ready?
Welcome to America's #1 Chadcast worldwide. This is Call Me Al. With the debate of all debates, the question of all questions, we are joined by Styx and Nick Fuentes. Today's central topic is Christianity in the United States. Now, my name is Alan Erickson, but you can call me Al. I find myself in the middle of Nick and Styx. I'm fascinated by the occult and all the esoteric knowledge, but I am a confirmed Catholic. And as I get older, Christianity starts to make more and more sense. Politically, I represent the Al right. We work out, we read books, we listen to podcasts, we're nationalists, that's basically it. Well, you are all welcome to join the Al right. It's popping. We got the best Chadcast in the world. I love being ethnically Catholic because the Irish, the Italians, the Spaniards, even the Mexicans, some of the most badass nationalities or ethnicities or whatever you want to call it are Catholic. And I think that's very cool. But I always struggled as it pertains to kind of being bored when I go to church. I'm what you call a slacker Catholic. I go to church like once or twice a year just because I get kind of bored. I've always been envious of the black churches with their performance art. Even Louis Farrakhan, when he talks about the power of Almighty God. Dude, that gets me going. I love it. I love it. So welcome to our Chadcast. Subscribe to this channel, like this video. We're going to have an unbelievable, excellent time. I've combined these forces for tonight. And you guys can introduce yourselves. Nick, how you doing?
Doing well, Al. Glad to be here. Glad to be here defending the faith, defending the one, the way, and the light. So I'm excited for a great debate. Looking forward to it.
And Styx, how you doing tonight?
I'm glad to be here as well, here to clank my spoon and hopefully expose the Pope.
Wow. So the central theme is Christianity in the United States. Now, here's our first question, and we'll start with you, Nick. Do you agree, or do you both agree, Nick will go first, then Styx will respond. Do you both agree that there is a lack of morality in the United States and nihilism is a problem in American culture?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think the best example of this was the school shooting that we saw a few weeks ago on Valentine's Day in February. I think when you see these horrendous acts of violence, I think when you see systemic and epidemic drug abuse, suicide, hedonistic sex, and other forms of degeneracy, I think you absolutely have a crisis of nihilism in the country. I think this is one of the few things that all generations, all people can relate to, young or old, middle-aged, men, women, the lack of meaning in our lives. And this has come, I think, foundationally from the removal of God from the public square, the removal of God from our personal lives. And so I absolutely think nihilism is a problem, and that's my diagnosis for why it's here.
Styx.
I would agree that there are grave problems within our culture, but I see them as slightly different maybe than the way that Nick sees them. I think we both, like the left and right, all different groups within culture, see that there are problems today. I think we diagnose them differently. He says fundamentally that it's the removal of God. He would, I assume, mean the Christian God or the Catholic God by that. But that deity is actually more prevalent in many people's day-to-day lives than it was at the founding of this country. Ultimately, we were founded upon a deist principle. It was Christian in nature, although not rudimentarily Catholic. However, this concept that there's a mass problem with degeneracy within the culture, really it depends on your own opinion of what that happens to be. Certainly there's been a societal breakdown. I see that as a breakdown along the lines of we've got corrupt, entrenched political bodies that are largely Christian, although they're not particularly religious. And despite that fact, it doesn't do anything to rein in their corruption.
Okay. Now, how this is going to work, you guys, I have a set list of questions. I have a ton of questions. Now, if the audience has any questions, you can ask so via Super Chat. I can't keep up with the chat right now. It's crazy. There's a bunch of spoons. There's a bunch of knives. The chat is absolutely insane. So if you ask a question in the chat, there's no chance I'm going to be able to read it. But if you want to ask a question, you know how to do it. I have a ton of questions already here that these guys have approved. They've looked over and they've agreed on. So I'm really excited. So that's how this is going to work. Again, thank you for being here. This is truly unbelievable. So, Nick.
Yes.
We'll start with you again and give Styx his response, right? Actually, we'll start with Styx this time. Okay. This is a better way to do it. Styx, would the proliferation of Christianity be beneficial to the United States?
No, because if Christianity were beneficial to the United States, we wouldn't be in such a mess to begin with. The nation, when society began to break down, I'm sure this is probably something that I would agree with Nick on, around the time of maybe the late 50s through the 60s, you begin to have systemic problems within the culture. That was all led by a country. It was 90+% Christian. The politicians were almost all Christian. We had at the time an immigration system which banned people from a lot of non-Christian parts of the world from even taking part in the culture. Now, boiling it down to a mere conspiracy would be one thing, but let me ask this. If you do, what safeguard does Christianity, or I should say Catholicism specifically, even provide? Because I look at the voting landscape. I look at the voting demographics in the last, however many elections. Catholics vote overwhelmingly in favor of things like gun control, in favor of abortion, in favor of what I'm sure would be generally considered by people on, maybe the fringe right or the new right, certainly libertarians, to be degenerate or to at least be bad for the country. What safeguard has Christianity ever given this country against these things?
Well, I think that's sort of interesting that you define Christianity as Catholicism. Now, I would certainly say that for one to be in communion with Christ's church, you would have to be Catholic. But actually, since the Vatican II Council, Catholics have held that Protestants are still our Christian brethren. If you believe that Jesus Christ is a Savior, if you're baptized, if you believe that the Bible is the Word of God, we believe that you are a Christian. So it's very interesting from the get-go that you're trying to straw man me already by saying that that it's better or worse based on like some kind of Catholic revitalization as opposed to the country just being Christian. I also think it's interesting that you attribute the problems that have gone on in the country as a result of the decline of Christianity to Christianity. Can we say that the adverse and pernicious social trends of the 50s and 60s were a result of Christianity? Did they happen because of Christianity or in spite of it? I also think it's interesting that you asked for safeguards against degeneracy in Christianity when there are no similar standards applied to paganism, applied to nihilism, when, as you've seen religion on the decline in the United States, in Europe, you see a proportionate increase in sexual hedonism, in greed, in public vices. And don't get me wrong, there have always been vices, but have they been systemic? Have they been normative? Have they been on television? Have they been, held up by our public officials, by celebrities as moral or as though they're okay? I don't think so. So I think it's all very interesting. And then additionally, my last point would be this. Styx, you have held in the past that there is no such thing as objective evil. And I don't think anybody who doesn't believe in God can even believe in any evil at all. You can only say that you might think it's evil. So I don't know how you could point to anything and say it's morally wrong or something is wrong at all when you have no objective standard to base that on.
There are objective standards within my own life. I use them anecdotally, number one. I simply say that for myself, I believe in a right and wrong, but I don't attempt to project it on others without any certainty. I don't claim moral objectivity. Number two, I never said, this is a straw man that you're trying to use, I never said that Christians were the cause of those problems starting, 50s and 60s, Red Scare era. You've got the hippies and drugs and all these things you identify as morally problematic. I never said Christianity was the responsible party, but I'm saying that in a culture that was overwhelmingly Christian, and not only overwhelmingly Christian, but far more religiously Christian, why is it that culture, if it was being led by such a morally virtuous group, could fall by the wayside into such habits and patterns? And by the way, it was pointed out, I'm not sure whether you're a fan of eugenics or not, Historically speaking, if we look at some of the earliest Victorian occult literature, we see a great appreciation for paganism as having safeguarded, especially the Northern European people, from the same problems that were ended up being introduced by foreign cultures, specifically the Christianized Romans, who, by the way, had already achieved their cultural peak, had achieved basically peak technology in every other possible way, and hit their highest wealth under paganism. Around the time of Christianity, they convert. Within a couple of centuries, the western half of the empire is in shambles. The eastern half slowly falls into decadence, despite being overwhelmingly Christian. Again and again, we see these cultures, not just Christian, although it's definitely of import that this is the case. They fare little better than other religious cultures. Secularism, in the sense of atheism, appears to be what you're arguing against. I'm simply arguing in favor of some degree of pluralism. State secularity and paganism, I think, was a better thing for the European cultures than Christendom. Yes, absolutely.
Well, from the beginning, it's sort of interesting. You say, well, people were Christian, and it wasn't because of Christianity that things went wrong, but there was Christians that made things go wrong. Why do you think people embraced contraception in the 1950s and 60s against Christian doctrine? They embraced contraception. They embraced, according to the Catechism of the Catholic Church, we are against birth control. We're against contraception. So this is against Christian doctrine. They pursued hedonistic, impulsive sex, premarital sex against Christian doctrine. You had the abuse of drugs. You had the sexual revolution. All this happened, again, and I say this again, this happened as Christianity declined, but it also happened in spite of Christian doctrine, in spite of Christian teaching. So, I mean, you seem to be arguing against Christians as opposed to arguing against the doctrine of Christianity. Wait. If we embraced the doctrine of Christianity, then you would see public morals improve. And then to answer the second point, first we have to talk about the framing of the second point, which is you say that, well, the high watermark essentially of the Roman Empire was achieved under paganism, was achieved under a non-Christian or in your later words, more pluralistic society. Well, that's interesting that you say that you attribute the decline of the Roman Empire to Christianity when that wasn't even adopted as the official religion until the 4th century. So the Roman Empire...
Yeah, the time of the collapse, exactly.
The Roman Republic had been there for centuries, and yet you attribute this to Christianity. I would offer a counterexample and say that the British Empire reached the peak of its wealth. This was the biggest empire in world history. 25% of the land in the world was controlled by Britain as a Christian country. The United States, their power and their wealth peaked either after 1945, I think you could contend. I think you could contend in 1960. You could contend in 1991 they reached their zenith. All of these points were when they were Christian, not when they were pagan or secular or anything like that. So I think both
point out in the context of the United States, one quick point, because I'm sure we get to go on to the next question at some point. One quick point. Isn't it funny that the motto of this country was E pluribus unum until the 1950s? Around the time of the societal breakdown, we declare we're going to say, in God we trust on all of our currency, and inject religion into every aspect of the public square. Prior to that, it had always been understood that people in the West or in the U.S. could be religious, that we were led by a God, but we didn't attempt to corrupt it by putting it in with the state. And I see the Vatican roughly as a counterpart to this within the Catholic core. The very concept of creating such a centralized hierarchical system, as opposed to letting people have their own spirituality and saying, well, yeah, I believe in Jesus, or I believe in some other deity or some other force, inevitably corrupts because power corrupts. The power over their life is no longer a disembodied spirit, a distant God who they can talk to at night before bedtime. It's a state, or it's a priest, or it's some imam or cleric. I see that as probably the greatest corrupting force of all, yes.
Are we going to move on, or can I rebut that?
Honestly, I could listen to this all day. This is so fascinating, and we got two of the biggest brains on the internet. We got two of the biggest superstars on the internet. We got a few super chats. We will get to all of them. But if you got something to say in response, I mean, I'm a fan of both of you guys.
Well, I just, so am I?
Go ahead, brother. Go ahead.
I think it's kind of patently absurd to say that, this anti-communist injection of Christianity into the public school system and the coining of the currency within God we trust was the mark of, now it's a Christian nation. It wasn't when it was 97% Christian at the founding of the country, when they did prayers before the constitutional conventions, when they were believers in God, and it was, in the Declaration of Independence, we are endowed by our Creator with unalienable rights. I mean, this is based on a conception of a world with a God. The country, the consensus was Christian. People were involved. It wasn't this, occult, like personal spirituality thing. People were Christian. People went to church much more often. This was observed even in the generations preceding the boomers. You look at the boomer generation and you look at church attendance, and it went like this. And those are people that were born after 45. The same time you're saying that, well, because we started coining the currency a certain way, then suddenly it became Christian, and that's when you saw the decline. I don't think anybody would say that MTV and cable television and contraception and sexual promiscuity is Christian. And you seem to be arguing anti-Christian morals are bad, and yet so Christian, people are responsible for that. The answer is then don't get rid of Christianity. It's make Christians more accountable to Christianity. Make them believe again, abide by the virtues again.
You can't make them believe, number one. Number two, I would say those sorts of things, promiscuity and so forth, were already prevalent anyway. They just were more underground. They were taboo and not spoken of as much. Have you even read Christian literature from the mid-1700s? I edit some of this stuff for a living. You go through and they're talking about, here's a fortune of when you're going to tie the nuptial knot and embrace hymen and all of these other things. They spoke about sex. We're talking the 1700s. They spoke about Christian astrology. They thought that God had put things in a certain order in the sky for religious reasons. They governed basically every aspect of their spiritual life by celestial movements and by essentially pagan lore anyway. These were the wisest people around, the most literate. They wrote books on it. They governed the original country by it. The original motto wasn't "In God We Trust." It wasn't even "E pluribus unum." It was "Mind your own business." Our first motto within the United States has nothing to do whatsoever with Christianity. Of course, they were Christians because they were born up in a European culture, pan-European diaspora, that believed in the Christian God, but they didn't believe in organized religion. They didn't believe in a church being paired with the state. And in fact, if you read some of their private writings, especially with Benjamin Franklin, my goodness, the dude went whoring constantly. He would put any boomer or Gen X or millennial to shame in the bedroom department. He was a Christian, yes, but he wasn't religious. He openly spurned organized religion, said, oh yeah, build a lighthouse, don't build a church, it's more useful.
Well, again, it's just patently absurd to me to say that, well, because Christians are not following Christian doctrine, throw away Christian doctrine. Again, the country was, and you seem to think this is like arbitrary, that the country was composed of almost 100%. Oh, well, it was just because they were European and they just happened to be Christians. It wasn't by accident that they were Christian. It wasn't by accident that this free Western liberal country was established by Christians. I mean, these ideas
But they weren't Catholics, now were they? They were Protestants mostly.
Okay, but they were Christians, and what we're defending here is Christian doctrine. People who believe in salvation through Christ, people who believe that the Bible is the Word of God. And
there is a difference. Christianity is schismatic. That would be like saying a Norse pagan and a Roman pagan a la the Mediterranean style religion are the same thing. They're both pagans, yeah.
But they have that. We're talking about Christianity.
Different things.
But we're talking about, but even Catholics recognize that Protestants are Christian. We define Christian. You may not be in communion.
Protestants don't see it that way.
We may not be in communion with Christ's church, but we are separated brethren. That's the official.
That's the church run by a heretical Marxist who.
Okay, and here we go.
So Styx, you seem to think this schism is.
Here we go with the slander.
Styx, you think this schism between Protestant Christianity and Catholicism is quite important. Can you expand on that?
I think it's important because I've spoken with people on both sides. I used to in the past be more understanding of the Catholic side because I was more socially liberal or laissez-faire, you could say. I saw the Catholic side generally as maybe a little bit morally more virtuous. In time, though, I realized the Vatican is basically a corporation. It's going to remain that way, always has been that way. They simply adopted pagan doctrine, adopted pagan holidays, passed it off as a religion, and they took the words of Christ essentially completely out of context. I always thought that Protestants that pointed this out were absolutely apeshit. I thought they were totally fucking crazy. In time, I realized essentially they were right. I can look at pagan literature, new neo-pagan literature. I can look at occult literature from the Victorian age on forward. They fundamentally agree with the most fire and brimstone evangelicals that I've ever listened to. When I come to realize that, I say maybe there's something to these Protestants ultimately that say we're going to cut a birthday cake for Jesus this Christmas instead of erecting a tree because we don't want to be caught dead worshiping Saturnalia.
Wow. And
yeah, okay. On the schism here, again, you seem to be conflating Catholicism. Well, actually, first of all, to address this fire and brimstone stuff, and they took it out of context and the pagan roots of Christianity. Let me dispel this myth very quickly. There is nothing. You cannot trace the antecedents of Christ the figure in paganism. You may have seen there are some resurrections in Horus, there are some resurrections in paganism, but the idea of Jesus Christ as the flesh and blood, the Son of God, but also in communion, also one and the same with the Holy Trinity, and being put up on a cross and then rising from the dead. It exists nowhere.
He wasn't even crucified on the cross. He was hanging off a tree.
That is just simply not true.
Hanged off a tree. The original definition has nothing to do with crucifixion.
There is historical evidence of crucifixion.
Eusebius seemed to think so.
Yeah, and Josephus and Tacitus and many others
never talked about Jesus Christ.
Josephus did talk about Jesus Christ.
No, he didn't. That passage is a legal forgery. The first
there's one which is
with Tacitus.
There is one passage by Josephus which is put in question, but there is one which nobody disputes. And Tacitus also acknowledged that Jesus Christ.
I've never heard of that, but there is Tacitus.
Look into it.
There is Tacitus, but it's funny how these early people don't even say, "Oh, he was crucified. He was crucified as a heretic."
Well, Tacitus,
may not have even overlapped with Pontius Pilate.
If you look at, and it's interesting to me because people, if we're going to get into the historicity of Jesus Christ in the New Testament, it's funny because people will all day long affirm the veracity and the validity of things like the Iliad, of things like the existence of King Arthur, many other things where, for example, the Iliad, we did not see a complete collection of the Iliad writings until 1,800 years after Homer lived. 1,800 years. And nobody says, well, we don't know what Homer said in the Iliad. We don't know what was contained in the Iliad, even though it was the first complete account of 1,800 years later. And you had fragments.
For sure.
Fragments. Wait, can you let me finish it?
That's the occult.
Hold on, guys. Hold on. Well, let's Nick just finish for like 1 to 2 minutes, and then Styx will get his response. Sure. This is the debate of all debates. Thanks for being here. Thanks for watching, everybody. This is awesome. Go ahead, Nick.
The point that is being made is that, King Arthur, another example, he's not even mentioned until 500 years after he supposedly reigned in any historical text. We know that he lived. We know the details of his life. And the same is true of many other ancient accounts. To get into textual studies, when we're looking at ancient texts, we're lucky if we get 1 or 2 historical sources. And with Jesus Christ, we have many. We have many secular as well as those in the New Testament. We have Josephus, we have Tacitus, we have Lucian, even pagans acknowledged he existed. And if you even look at the New Testament, which I think is not unfair, you look at, for example, in 1 Corinthians, St. Paul delivers a creed, and that is dated by scholars of the subject, that was recited and gathered within 25 years of Christ's crucifixion, within 25 years. And if you look at how he was able to have that in such a short amount of time, it was probably compiled less than 3 years, or around 3 years after Christ's crucifixion. Additionally, if you look at ancient New Testaments, you can look at ancient Greek New Testaments, of which there are 5,500 that exist from the first few, of which 50 exist from the first few centuries. You have 15,000 ancient New Testaments in other languages. So the idea that there's like no accounting for Christ's existence or the New Testament is fiction, this is the result of very recent rationalizations of atheism. Nobody doubted this, not pagans, not the Roman government, not religious people, thousands of years.
Styx's turn. Thanks, Nick.
Totally wrong. I had a text from the 18 and 1900s that say the same thing, and they were not written by atheists. They were written by people. Some of them were pagans. Many of them were Christians. They were simply Christians involved with science. They felt that religion could be explained in part by science. Science could be informed by religion. It's the basis of eugenic thought. Some of them were written by people they were agnostic or deistic. The concept that you have a Bible that was compiled, it was only compiled in 50 or 60 AD, that doesn't prove the existence of a Jesus. And let us assume there's a Jesus. Which Jesus is it? Is it the Gnostic Jesus? Is it the Jesus that you happen to believe in? Is it the Mormon Jesus? How do we know that Joseph Smith didn't find some crazy gold leaf book? We can't know that for sure. What I'm saying is that's a pretty piss poor way to govern anything. It didn't work when we had major league Christianity in the U.S. It didn't work. It didn't save the British from fracturing apart. It didn't save the French Empire. You look at Islam, it doesn't save people. None of these religious groups ever had. The only answer is, oddly enough, the one that you seem to have arrived at with your nationalism, which is a sort of tribalism. Paganism is nothing more than the spiritual extension of that same tribal mentality.
Okay.
Well, the difference between paganism and Christianity is that Christianity is true. At the end of the day, I mean, we seem to have already conceded.
This is where you both philosophically disagree, though.
You had 2,000 years to order the world, to improve it, and look at the world around you.
Do you think our task is progressives? Do you think that we believe that we will create the world to come? I think if you believe that was the task of the church fathers,
the Christian is to make money off.
Sorely mistaken.
The church.
All right.
Oh, I see.
Guys, let's move on. Let's move on. Because you guys both fundamentally disagree with your own spiritual beliefs. But what we have in common is behind us, the United States of America, now Styx. If Christianity isn't the best way to improve morality in the United States, what is? This is for Styx.
Encouraging people to have morality, but they've got to do it themselves. They've got to have a cultural reason for it. What we've seen in our breakdown of culture is that people no longer feel they have something to live for. Now, you can say, well, then we'll give them Jesus. They can live for Jesus. They can live for the church. We've tried that. It's been tried in Western cultures. It didn't work. People forsook that. Then they chased after everything else under the sun. Something else has to be designed, and it's obvious. It can't be religious in its main component. It can't even be paganism in the old, strictly understood sense that some pagan living 2,000 years ago would maybe have. It can be nationalistic. It can be tribalistic. Ultimately, at the end of the day, though, it won't be Christianity. Christianity is a multicultural, globalized religious force that comes out of the Middle East after multiple tribes plagiarized one another. It was then spread to Rome. It spread throughout the Mediterranean. And then, as it converges and turns into Protestantism, goes into Northern Europe, then all of a sudden it improves a little bit, crosses the ocean simply because it was there. And then you have the promulgation of Christianity within this hemisphere from both the Catholic and the Protestant side. It is a multicultural religion that mainly, if you look today in the world, the most religious Christians that you'll find, funnily enough, are in places like West Africa or Mexico. Now, what I would say is if Catholicism or Christianity were so beneficial, were so great for a culture, why aren't they first world countries? Why isn't Brazil a superpower by now? Why isn't Mexico much more developed? Why aren't they the ones saying, hey, we're going to build a wall, keep these godless fucking Americans out? Why isn't that happening? Why does it seem like the supposedly decadent, godless culture that supposedly is degenerated and collapsing is the one trying to safeguard itself against these others?
Nick, your response.
Well, yeah, you know what I think is fascinating is you were asked the question of how do we improve morals in the United States, and it turns into this screed, this derisive screed with this derision about Christianity. It's just very interesting how you simply cannot contain your hatred for the religion, and that's very interesting. That's number one.
It's certainly not hatred.
We're talking about
talk about Islam.
I didn't interrupt you, my friend. I didn't interrupt you. Number two, I think it's very interesting that Styx can even talk about something like morality that simply could not exist without a God. Certainly you would have subjective morality. You could have your personal morality, which, again, is entirely up to you and your practice. But can we define that certain things are right and certain things are objectively wrong without religion, without the existence of a God? The answer is no. And so how could we even, what does this talk about? How do we restore morality in the United States if there is no such thing as morality as objectively understood in the real world, but only in our subjective interpretation? For example, if Styx says that raping children is wrong, if there is no God, that's his personal opinion. That is his subjective opinion on what is moral. If I say, no, I think it's right, I think it's the best thing in the world, well, the only thing he can say is he disagrees with me and he finds that distasteful. Well, a lot of different people have a lot of different feelings on what is moral and what isn't. Look at the country today, right and left. Some people think abortion is okay. Some people think it's not. Some people think it's okay to mutilate children and make them transgender. Some people think it's not. Some people think it's okay to go to war with other countries, and on and on and on. And all we have to mediate these moral conflicts is well, people have this personal spirituality and the Catholic Church is a corporation. There is no answer to that question. There is simply no answer. There is no morality outside of God, objectively understood. And then to address the question of Christianity is multicultural. I mean, to read the Old Testament and believe that Christianity is multicultural, to read, for example, Genesis, the Tower of Babel, where God created the nations, where he scattered them and divided them by language and all the rest. And then additionally, but the Old Testament is the first book in the Christian Bible. And then to look at the Old Testament, which is a story about God favoring one tribe over others. Go forth and multiply. It's a message of natalism. It's a message of life. Go forth, and then he helps them conquer other neighbors. And then additionally, you could look in, and I'll pull this up just for you because I was interested in this.
You're bringing up so many things. I got to respond.
And you went all over the place about wealth and Mexico isn't rich and all this. If you actually look at the Catechism of the Catholic Church about immigration, because this is a common myth. If you look at the Catechism of the Catholic Church 2241, it says, the more prosperous nations are obliged to the extent that they are able, to welcome the foreigner in search of the security and the means of livelihood which he cannot find in his country of origin. And many people would say, we can interpret that as they want mass immigration, but it does say in terms of how they are able. Additionally, it says political authorities, for the sake of the common good for which they are responsible, may make the exercise of the right to immigrate subject to various juridical conditions, especially with regard to the immigrant's duties towards their country of adoption. Immigrants are obliged to respect with gratitude the material and spiritual heritage of the country that receives them, to obey its laws, and to assist in carrying its civic burdens. Does that sound like mass immigration to you folks? I don't think so.
All right, Nick, you broke it down. We got to give Styx a chance to respond. Yeah.
That's not in the way you interpret it, no, but the Pope seems to interpret it a different way. I think most Catholics are going to listen to him over you, which might be unfortunate for the Catholic churches and Western civilization's survival in the future. It's funny that you would bring up the Vatican or Catholicism at all in the realm of, raping babies. I think that if you were to say that you thought that was a good thing, you'd be actually agreeing with the Catholic Church, oddly enough, if we look at like Ratzinger, who, by the way, was put in there by Pope John Paul to see over the church abuse scandals, shuttled people around, then becomes Pope. What a holy organization. Your entire argument regarding the Old Testament is funny because you're talking about, God, the Tower of Babel, which, by the way, is a Babylonian myth that the Jews adapted and changed around. It's literally recorded within Babylonian lore on their, I believe, cuneiform, or I don't know if it dates to the Sumerian period. Literally speaking, you are taking a Zionistic explanation and using that to promulgate your concept of New Testament post-nationalism somehow, it appears. I'm not can you please explain to me why would you use the Old Testament, which is Jewish?
Is that your response?
According to the Jews, why would you use that to prop up, I don't know what form of nationalism you would want to prop up?
Nick,
first of all,
globalist religion.
I think it's hilarious how I bring all the facts and I really just deconstruct the heart of the argument about morality, and you respond with kind of this, boo-hoo, actually it's Babylonian roots. Well, here's why. To answer the nationalistic,
history matters,
you're not going to touch the question of morality. I'll get to the Jewish part of it. Here's the common misconception about Judaism and Christianity. The Jews rejected Jesus Christ. The modern Jews that you see today are derived from the rabbinical, the Talmudic tradition. These are the Pharisees that were responsible for the crucifixion of Christ. So to say that the Jews of the Old Testament are in any way bearing any kind of resemblance to the Jews of today, which see their scripture not as the 5 books of Moses, but as the Talmud, as rabbinical law and the halakha, that all that kind of stuff is just evident that you don't know the facts. That's number one. But then number two, the Old Testament, that is the first covenant. I mean, testament means covenant. That's the first covenant that God makes, the Christian God makes with people on earth, which is the Jewish people. Now, Jesus Christ came to save the Jewish people, and they rejected him. And so Jesus Christ then became a savior for all mankind. So this is just betraying a fundamental misunderstanding of what Judaism is today. And then to invoke Zionism, which is a 19th century political ideology, again, which says we should have the Holy Land. I mean, nowhere can you find this in the Bible. Maybe you can find it in the Schofield Bible, which is, again, a total and complete mistranslation of the Bible. But I mean, it's just, you just don't understand what you're talking about.
My point is, though, you want to talk about morality. Okay, let's touch upon that.
Okay.
Your view of morality is informed by, in part, your interpretation of that Catholicism. What I am saying to you is, does it not matter that throughout time Christians have looked at the same scripture, interpreted it differently, translated it differently, schismed into groups which see it differently? The Pope sees it differently, I believe, than you. What makes you think that you're superior to any of these other groups? And how, therefore, if there is such confusion, how can that even be used for the objective standard of morality that you hope to impart upon a state because you see it as degenerating, as decaying, maybe away into atheism or sexual immorality, as you would say it, or any of these other problems? How is it going to solve anything? Whereas with paganism, it's fairly cut and dry. You don't really need to interpret it. What have you read Plato's Republic? Plato comes out in part of his arguments, or I should say Socrates, rather, through this. Speaking of the concept that a religion should be actually actively designed by the state, for instance, telling people, it would be a lie, it would be a mythology, telling people, oh, the reason why there's inequality in our culture is people were formed out of different metals in the earth. So the soldier, he was formed from iron, and this worker was formed from copper, and this person was formed from clay or silver or whatever. And so this helps to stabilize the culture. The idea is that creating that morality, whether the objective or whether it's being just sort of compiled as a stand-in for real spirituality, now it has a purpose, a pragmatic purpose. Pragmatism matters. What is pragmatic about using the same Christianity that has failed for over 1,500 total years to try to govern cultures?
All right. Well, you're asking two questions. The first question is about how is the Pope the infallible Jew?
That's not what I'm saying. I didn't.
What are you saying?
People infallibility. I'm saying. Okay. I'm saying that the Pope, with his high-powered degree and his white robe, sitting in the Vatican as the head of Catholicism, according to most Catholics, why would a Christian, or a Catholic in specific, hold your interpretation of dogma maybe to be better than his? Because he'll come out and say, well, build bridges, don't build walls.
Oh,
walls
but Styx, you're making a mistake here.
I'm not going to judge this group of people. Why is it that your interpretation of that same general...
I will tell you, because Pope Francis, when Pope Francis goes out and talks about politics, he is not using his power of papal infallibility. When the Pope goes out there and says things like we should be building bridges and we should take care of the earth, this is not an invocation of papal infallibility. He is speaking. So
you exonerate him for his personal views.
I'm not exonerating anybody. I'm simply saying that to say that, well, here is this authority. Sure, I mean, he is an authority in the church and people respect what he has to say, but the catechism that's what the Catholic Church believes. That's what's doctrinal. And so if you read that and you say that the immigrants have to welcome X, Y, and Z, and you read exactly what it says, what is actually doctrinally Catholic, there's no argument that you can make. So you have to say, oh, well, the Pope said some touchy-feely things about building bridges, which are not infallible, which is him. I don't know what he's saying by that. Maybe he's saying we should remember to keep that in mind when we're talking about walls and everything. Who knows? But if we're actually looking at doctrinal Catholicism, whether Pope Francis comes and goes, whether there's a new Pope or an old Pope, that is what it says about immigration. And Catholics can read that and they can understand that. Now, if the Pope said, and I would concede this, if the Pope said, and he invoked his powers infallibly, and he was contributing to the dogma, if he was going into that function, and he said all that, then I would say we would have a problem. But he didn't do that. He's speaking as simply a Catholic. And again, you keep bringing up this problem of, there's problems. Christianity doesn't solve everything. Christianity is not a panacea. You look at Christian countries and they're not superpowers, or not first world countries. And Christianity was never intended to be this political solution to all problems. It was never intended to cure poverty. That's not why we believe there. It is not a consequentialist belief in Christianity. We don't adopt Christianity because we believe it'll make us better off, it'll make us more wealthy. We believe it because it's a truth. And if our souls are in communion with God, that's a good thing. It's ultimately a rejection of the temporal world. And I would ask you, you look at the suffering around the world, you look at people being blown to smithereens, people getting executed, you look at horrible injustices. And me, as a Catholic, I can sit well with that because this can be rectified in another life. For atheists, there is no justice. And forget even there's no such thing. So that means you're an apatheist. Nothing. You're an apatheist.
All right, Styx' turn to respond. Just wrap it up in like 20 seconds. Styx' turn.
You're saying, therefore, it doesn't really matter so much to you if things in the world are fucked up. So why would you be a nationalist? Why the hell would you care if the white race was maintained? Why would you care if a nation was maintained? So really, if you're going down that road where you're saying, well, in the afterlife, it's all going to be great. Well, also in the afterlife, I guess there won't be a problem with race. Well, then that kind of blows some of your views out of the water. Meanwhile, you're basically saying the Pope isn't even a spiritual authority unless he invokes his infallibility. Then we've got a problem. But if the Pope comes out as the highest man in Catholicism and simply suggests that you take in more immigrants, simply suggests that, closed borders, it's a bad thing, that won't have a measurable impact upon the behavior of Catholic world leaders, of Catholic lay people towards
I'm not saying it doesn't.
Exactly. It'll have a measurable impact. So what the hell does it matter?
Well,
the Protestant doesn't care if he invokes papal infallibility.
Here's why. Because again, you keep saying that Christians or Catholics are the same as Catholic doctrine and Christian doctrine. These are very different things. The Pope can say one thing today, he can say another thing tomorrow, but the catechism does not change. The magisterium does not change. The wisdom does not change that is in the doctrine. So you're talking about men, which Christ, and when he established his church, he never said that the people in the church would be without sin. He never said that. He never said that the Pope would be without sin. The only people that are without sin in the Christian religion are Jesus Christ and Mary, and that's it.
All right,
and so they're trying to describe on. Wait.
Okay. You got it. Hey, Fuentes, you got about a minute, and then we'll give Styx a final word on this.
Probably move on to another question.
Yeah. So
Fuentes,
you got this, and then Styx, you got the floor.
So to try and ascribe this, because the Pope said something I disagree with, or this person said something I disagree with, well, throw out Christianity, throw out Catholicism. It's just very silly. That's number one. And then number two, this idea that just because we don't believe that Christianity is a panacea for temporal problems, then we just, whatever, it can all go to hell. Everything can just, who cares? Very different things. Christianity can improve. It has improved. You look at the most prosperous, the most successful countries in the history of the world, they're all Christian. Great Britain, the United States, Germany when it was at its industrial peak, Russia, an Orthodox country. Not the Soviet Union, obviously, but the Russian Empire, all Christian countries. I don't think anybody would dispute the fact that Christendom is responsible for the scientific revolution, for reason, for everything in the modern world we see today. And other countries may have taken part in it, but we're the progenitors of it. That's what Christianity has offered the world.
Christianity was actually antithetical to the scientific revolution. I can look back at texts and see, the church said that the world was not indeed round, despite the fact that it was widely known at the time and used to occasionally kill people for that. Now, granted, that was less common than like an atheist would say. But you keep dragging out this one funny argument. Why is it that we are only arguing about the relative virtue of Christendom? And we're not also saying, hey, there's relative virtue to paganism? Because those cultures, again, before Catholicism invaded, in some cases hundreds of years into the Christian period within Rome, depending on the proximity to the Mediterranean basin, there was already culture. There was already civilization. People were already governing themselves. They already had kingdoms. They already had fortresses and walls and everything else that the Romans had. The difference is, of course, they didn't have as much manpower. Ultimately, it boiled down to politics. Just like Rome ultimately only even adopted Christendom to have a standardized religion. If it had been up to the military, they would have become Mithraists. That was the main military cult. You'd be speaking probably a language other than English right now, and you'd be worshiping Mithra. Essentially, you'd still be worshiping a Christ-like figure, oddly enough, because it'd coincide. The birthday would be the same. There'd be some of the sun imagery in the most literal sense. I fail to see, though, how is it that these groups, in spite of not being Christian, they had order, they had law and order, they had virtue, they had a concept of right and wrong. It doesn't require Jesus to have an objective view of right and wrong. The Muslims have a very objective view of what is or is not right. It's just a different one from what you have. And I'm sure you would say, well, it's degenerated too. Okay, yeah, I would agree with you. Where do you make the objective argument then? And do you really, by the way, I think there's one last thing I'd like to say.
Sure.
Within the constitutional framework of the U.S., why would you want to set a legal precedent for the use of a religion, perhaps for moral reasons at all, when we've got Islam invading the Western world? And it seems like Christian leaders don't want to do anything about it, despite routinely being religious, so-called.
Sure. So first, to address the scientific revolution argument, the church and science have been at war forever. I mean, this is middle school level history. We all know, I think everybody who knows anything about the Middle Ages understands that the church actually invented the university system. If you actually look back at the high Middle Ages, the reason that we even have university at all is because, or at least the modern university in the way that we look at it,
Muslims make the same argument.
The church
Muslims make the same argument. We invented this.
And in Western Europe. In Western Europe, we invented
there were academies and learning centers.
And hey, listen, I let you finish. Maybe we need some objective morality on interrupting, right? But then you look at, we invented the university system. Not only that, but if you look at the foremost, really the Catholic Church's official philosopher of the church, Thomas Aquinas, the philosophers who justified the existence of God, the early church fathers, these were not people who were based on superstitious belief and they were numbering the stars. Thomas Aquinas set out to find, how can we, through reason and rationality, create a metaphysical demonstration for God's existence? And this was 1,000 years ago. And this is the premier philosopher of Christianity. Additionally, you had Galileo, you had Jesuits who agreed with Galileo, you had Jesuits who preached Galileo. So you talk about some of these early, people were thrown out because they didn't believe in what the church said. One of the reasons why Galileo was thrown in jail by the church was because he did not prove his argument. His early arguments about the earth revolving around the sun was based on tides, saying that the tides were shaken up in a particular way, had nothing to do with anything else. And there were very good arguments against it that were made by the church. And then additionally, not only was he challenging the church on this doctrine, and he couldn't even prove it at the time, but on top of that, he was reinterpreting Bible verses. He was out there saying the church was misinterpreting the Bible. This was 100 years after the Protestant Reformation, and he was a layman challenging the church on the Bible. I mean, so there were so many other factors in that. It is not a coincidence that the scientific revolution was born out of Christianity, that the Enlightenment was born out of Christianity. Take any one of your friends from the scientific revolution. Newton, for example, was a Catholic. Okay, and you look at many of the scientists, and they were Christians. So that is a scientific myth. I don't know. Is Al going to cut me off, or can we proceed?
No, that was good. Hey, Styx is going to have a chance to respond. This is unreal. And then after Styx' response, we're almost at halftime, which is unreal. So we'll take some super chat questions at halftime, the good ones. So if you guys want to submit a question, do that. I see some really good ones here. So Styx will respond to that real quick.
To let the super chat people ahead, I'll try to keep it short. I'll just say this. It seems like Newton is constantly brought up, but no, Christian apologist for religiosity ever brings up Ben Franklin. They don't want to bring up many of these other Christian individuals who ultimately were deists, very intelligent, yes, rational and scientific. It's not organized religion that they liked, though. They're like, yeah, there's a God, there's a Jesus Christ. Church, I don't have time for that. I'm going to my laboratory.
Okay. So first question we got here. Can either guest recommend an intermediate weight training program? Absolutely not. That's totally unrelated. Email me, because this is the Chadcast, and I will respond, and I will give you a great intermediate weight training program. Do you think that religion is that important? We'll start with Nick. Or should we focus on more on building localized and involved communities? This is from James Boogley. The prior one was from Capable Guardian. So...
yeah, sure. How do you think you build organized, involved communities but through religion? I mean, what do you think you do when you go to church, but you pray in communion with fellow believers? And for all these people who say, well, there are these secular concerns that supersede religion. Religion is the center. It's the core of all of them. At the end of the day, if you can't ask yourself, why are we doing this? Why are we here? What is the teleological reason that we exist? I think it's very difficult to get on with any kind of affair, at least if you have any questions about what's going on. So I think that the question of, well, should religion be more important or building communities? I think the question is one and the same. Build a community of believers, people that are motivated enough by their belief in the existence of God that they could drink death like water, as Fulton Sheen said. That's the kind of conviction we need.
Wow. Styx, your response.
I would say it doesn't matter whether it's religious or not. It's perfectly acceptable to structure your culture around religion. I would just prefer that, number one, there is secularity in part in the state. There has to be some degree of tolerance for people who dissent, because even that native population within that religion will, over time, because it's malleable, there will be new opinions that arise and so forth. Number two, you run the risk, I think, as you would with anything else, in all honesty, not just a religion. You run the risk at that point of using religion as sort of the central focus of your culture, of people just organizing around religion, becoming very zealous, but ultimately the state sort of lags off, I would say.
Okay, great. And this one we'll start with Styx, and then we'll go to Fuentes. Open question from Constantine's commenter. I'm sorry. Wouldn't you say the bigger issue is maintaining homogeneity of belief, whether it be Catholic, pagan, Muslim, etc.?
No, because if you look at some homogenous cultures, like most of the Islamic world, they're no better off. There are homogenous countries in Africa, whether they're Islamic, Christian, some of them are quasi-paganistic, spiritualistic, and in a rudimentary sense, they just don't do well. And it's not just because of colonialism. I know that the New Agers on the left will say, well, we robbed them of their resources, we evil Westerners, so that's why some of these countries are messed up. No, that's not why. The homogeneity of their culture also isn't helping them. What it is in a secular sense, the structures that they have created within their culture simply don't seem to have the sort of lasting stability that they need. I would say it's perfectly fine to have a mixed culture, like we see within the United States, even when it was mostly Christian. It's a mix of different Christian backgrounds. There were also Jews, Mormons, which is the sort of American version Christianity, and pagans as well, Mesoamerican religions, some of the Norse coming in as well. And it worked. It worked just fine. What really became the problem is that now the state in the Western world is trying to strip everyone of every identity that they have. It's not so much the particular religion, it's that they don't want them to have any spiritual background, any national loyalty, any family structure. That's really what's become the issue, I think, at this point.
Nick, your response.
Yeah, I actually agree with Styx on that last point about the state and, this corporatist kind of thing that we have now, stripping people of their identities. That's probably the biggest problem that we have. On the question of homogeneity, it's important to distinguish between homogeneous and homogeneous because they're different. But to get to the point, I think we believe in Christianity, or I believe in Christianity and Catholicism because it's a truth. And I think that a country is stronger when it abides by the truth, when it's in cohesion, it's in harmony with the person who made the universe. So I don't think it's necessarily about homogeneity. I think it's about what is true and are we in accordance with that. And I guess I agree with Styx to some extent that, religious homogeneity isn't necessarily all that it's cracked up to be. But I guess I disagree for different reasons.
Okay. Randy Williams, I'm assuming you're religious. He says, gentlemen, I'm Gen X, raising 2 children, 17 boys, 16-year-old girl. Both kids, compared to peers, I'm assuming they're not religious, seem to be instilled with a better ideal of future, love, and truth. Counter argument to the alternative. Yeah, it's a little bit unspecific, Randy Williams. Are you Christian or not? Can you please specify? And we will get back to you. Because it's kind of confusing. He doesn't really specify whether he's Christian or not. So, Randy, we really appreciate it. Please get back to us on that. Just donate $1, and then I'll get the notification. So I don't want to dismiss your question, Randy. I really appreciate it. But it would be better if you told us whether you were Christian or not. I'm assuming it, but I'm not going to have these guys answer a question that needs to be assumed. So, anyways, other question. Styx, could you elaborate on how the end of organized religion can help more spiritually focused Christians like me?
Exactly. When you have organized religion, I think the tendency for a lot of people is they get lazy, they listen to somebody else tell them what to believe. They don't really search any deeper themselves. What I've learned through years of literally working with spiritual materials is there's a great appreciation to be had for different opinions. Ultimately, at the end of the day, you can believe that one is the truth. Nick believes, hey, it's self-evident. There's a God. It's this particular God. I happen to disagree. Some people agree with him. Some won't. But at the end of the day, then, if you assume that that's true, why not at least investigate other things? Why do you need a church, per se, that might end up becoming corrupted to tell you what to believe in? Because if the church were really all that, if it weren't capable of being corrupted, you wouldn't have so many of the problems inherent in these things. It's not like paganism, which is very tribal. It's also very individualistic in many cases. There's a family element. There's certainly a nationalistic one. Ultimately, though, there's no ambiguity involved. You either are or are not a noble person according to those things. There's no, hey, I'm a Christian, therefore I did a bad thing, but I can be forgiven. No, there's no forgiveness for that. Be a good person. Don't do it again.
Okay. Well, to take the first point, you said I believed it was self-evident that God exists, and this is just very, very brief. I believe that God exists because of the cosmological arguments made by Aquinas and the teleological argument, not like self-evident. That's beside the point. To answer the question about organized religion, I don't know where this like contempt for organization comes from. Organization is not like hated in any other way, shape, or form, whether it's spontaneous or otherwise. The reason that we need organization, the reason to answer Styx's question, why do we need a church to tell us what's right and wrong? This is actually a very good question, and this is one that the Catholic Church alone can answer. There has to be authority. All authority in the world means nothing unless it comes from God, unless it comes from another person. Otherwise, you could say, well, you're just another man. What do you know? But with the Catholic Church, we have the distinction that Jesus Christ prayed for the faith of Peter. He said he's going to build his church on the rock, which is Peter, and his successors now are protected from fallibility by Jesus Christ. And the reason why this is necessary is because compare yourself, a Christian who reads the Bible, and your understanding of it is pretty mainstream compared to other Protestants or Catholics or whatever, a Western conception of Christianity. Now compare that to some of these Catholics in Central and South America, where they fuse it with tribal folk religions. There's one that's based on the saint of death, where there's executions, there's horrible violence, and they interpret the Bible in such a way that's repugnant to us. And if you don't believe that there's an authority that says one is Christian and one is not, well, their interpretation is just as good as yours. And there is no argument against that. I mean, that's not to say that it's just as good. It's to say that we don't know, because there is no authority telling us a Christian is this and not that. The Bible is this and not that. Otherwise, an African, some tribal person in Central and South America who's chopping off heads and say, hey, well, I'm a Christian. I'm just as Christian as you are. And who are you to say otherwise? And there's no answer.
But that claim of objectivity is itself a subjective claim. It's not based in observable evidence that any person, if it were, there would be no question about which religion was true. Everyone would be members of that same Christian religion, the one true faith, I'm sure you would call it. How do you determine, therefore, that the authority in an objective sense should be listened to at all by people who already disagree? Well, what it is you're presuming, I have to presume that your primordial argument, that your authority figure and your religion are true in order to take the argument for their trueness seriously. It's circular reasoning at its fine. And it is. It absolutely is, because you're saying, true. My God exists. This is the true religion. We need an authority to establish what that is. Why should I consider that particular authority? That's like saying that some berserker from some pagan tribe, I'm just going to listen to this dude. He knows what it's about. He saw the spirit in the sky or something. Well, no, I'd like to have my own experiences. I've had spiritual experiences. There's a reason I'm not an atheist. There's a reason I'm not anti-spiritualistic like I was many years ago. But that doesn't lead me to believe that somebody else needs to tell me how to interpret what I see.
Well, here's why that's different. Here's why that's not true. We have the Bible, and there's so much evidence that Jesus Christ was the Son of God. You can look at the prophecies in the Old Testament, of which there's 456. The odds that they could all come true is astronomical. You could look at the historicity of the New Testament, which many scholars do not refute up until very recently. But then outside of that, you can also look at the philosophy, which, by the way, it has never been disproved. The four cosmological arguments that are made by Aquinas, the teleological argument, these have never been disproved. So there's thousands of years of philosophy, of theology that has not been debunked, that probably hasn't even been read by the new atheists that exist, which is why we can demonstrate metaphysically through reason that God exists. And then when we look at the historical record, we can judge whether Christ was divine or not. If you accept these precepts based on reason and based on the historicity of the New Testament and the divinity of Christ, then you can come together and say, well, if if God is real, and then we look at the evidence that Christ's tomb was empty and he was crucified and people did have eyewitness accounts that he rose again, well, then he's probably God's son. And if he's God's son, then what he says is true. And if what he says is true, then we know that Peter is the rock of the church. He was handed the keys of the kingdom to heaven. And if we understand all of that being true, all of that we acknowledge, and there's lots of arguments for that, but this is the demonstration of it, then we understand that his successors in the papacy are an authority on what is Christian, what is the word of God. And so it's not circular reasoning. It doesn't come from, well, we just trust that guy. It comes from thousands of years of history, of theology, of metaphysics, of all. But atheists would like to convene
upon opinion.
What's that?
Opinion upon opinion.
Yeah. Well, and we know that in the nihilistic relativist world of paganism, I mean, we really don't believe in reason.
There's nothing relativistic
really
in paganism.
don't believe.
Nick, you know nothing. Nick, you know little about paganism. You conflated it with Satanism when you were responding to one of your viewers.
Because you were a Satanist, and I wrongly said
that's not what you said. You said Satanism, paganism. What's the difference?
Yeah, it's all the same to me.
Satanism is atheistic. Satanism is might is right, basically. It's a libertarian manifesto from the 1920s that LaVey plagiarized. That's what the COS represents.
But you understand the point that was being made. If it's not Christian,
the point you were making is that they were similar in some metaphysical manner. I can point you to many books from especially the eugenic period, a period I'm sure you have an appreciation for, that'll say, oh, the structure of the atom, the action of radium, and all of these scientific principles prove that Jesus was a mystic sorcerer, essentially. Theosophy is true, and we can have the utopia now, and Atlantis existed, and here's death rays and all this stuff. You can actually read this stuff. Read William Dower sometime. I can look for all sorts of texts on these subjects, but the fact that I can compile a bookshelf full of texts that generally agree with one another and say, well, this is the truth, doesn't actually make it true. It is still just people's opinion. Ultimately, those people I consider human. Let me grant that Jesus existed at all. Let me not even bother getting into the argument of whether that's even been objectively proven. Okay, there was a person named Jesus. People considered him to be God. There were other people who considered him to be a man. The latter were generally slaughtered out of existence, which might explain why Catholicism took off.
All right. So moving on.
Wait, but it doesn't answer the fundamental point, which is you believe that, well, when Aquinas makes an argument and nobody can refute it. I don't care about
what Aquinas said. He takes it as self-evident that there is this God anyway.
There you go. And this is the problem with the new atheists is this is what you sticks or whatever it is. I've seen you. Wait. I just let you finish. I see you, and what you do is you come on and you do this spout off. You do this rapid fire. Well, with all these really edgy, like middle school positions.
All right, guys.
And yet, wait, but there's the rebuttal for this. And yet you have not grappled with the arguments. You believe that, well, they're all just opinions. It's all just, and all opinions are equally valid. I mean, that's essentially what you're positing, and that's simply not true.
I'm saying that on something that hasn't been proven on a totally subjective basis.
The historicity of Jesus Christ and the metaphysical demonstration that God must exist, unless you hold the secrets.
The Catholic
that can answer
this God?
The cosmological arguments. Then I mean, I'm sorry, all you have is relativism, essentially.
All right,
it's not relativism, though. It's a different opinion. You can masquerade it as objective all you want.
But you haven't answered the opinion.
You haven't
refuted it.
You haven't shown me any. I have this problem with Christians. Years ago, I said this. This was back when I was an atheist. Now I'm paganistic, but it doesn't really change. I said, let me grant that there's even a single monotheistic God. Why is it your particular interpretation? Because there are also Christians, theologically based, classically trained, that say, no, if you believe in that certain way or do this certain thing, you go to hell. One person says you're saved by faith, another by grace, another by membership in a certain church or certain actions. Another says, well, you will manifest faith on the outside. Yes, you have to be saved like sinner's prayer mode, but you will manifest those good behaviors. You'll give to the poor and shelter the orphans and stuff. There are so many different opinions within Christendom. I'm not asking you, I don't really care even if you can prove that particular deity exists. It doesn't even matter because there are so many opinions about how to interpret the very doctrine.
Wow. Right. Well, I mean, if you say it doesn't matter if you can prove that God exists, I think that kind of says it all right there.
I'm simply saying that the objective basis of morality you are seeking for a political reason, for the United States, because that's basically what we're saying.
For a moral reason.
That can't be established by a religion that has so many schismatic tendencies. But paganism just says, yeah, these forces exist. As for the others, we don't care. The Jews were henotheists. They believed in all the other tribal totems being deities. They only worshipped one because they thought the others were evil. Did you even know that the very old T basis for your entire religion back during the Babylonian period is a henotheistic religious cult? It's a tribal, nationalistic, pagan cult that believed literally in these other deities. They believed in a Bel, literally a Belial. They believed in daimons in both senses, both the strictly evil sense and in the sense of lesser deities of sorts. They didn't believe in a single creator. They had Asherah that they were worshiping for a while. They weren't monotheists. They didn't even have a single god.
Really? The Old Testament is not monotheistic. Okay.
The Old Testament post-dates the primordial formation of Judaism.
This is opposite.
Oral stories, you can trace those oral stories back 1,000 years further to Babylon.
Yes, and there's truth in them. But what you do is you take 1,000 years of theology. Like, for example, have you read the four cosmological arguments that Aquinas makes for the existence of God?
It literally doesn't matter unless the basis of the religion is objective.
There's your answer. What you do is you take.
Have you read any of the texts that I've referenced?
No.
I'm not particularly interested in Aquinas because I've already studied Christendom.
Okay. Well, you haven't studied Christendom if you haven't studied Aquinas. But here's the point. You take what, this deity and superficial and this and that, and you obfuscate the reality. You don't want to grapple. I mean, you yourself say that you don't care if we can even prove that God exists. You don't even care if God does exist. You don't even care, you said in one video, if you went to hell. And I just don't understand how a serious person could look at somebody who doesn't even care. And by the way, this is such a fraud to say, I don't care if I'm burning in hell for eternity. It's inconsequential to me whether the preeminent, pure actuality exists in the universe. And then to argue and say, well, I'm going to be objective about this conversation. You've already admitted that it's irrelevant to you. And then you turn around and you use Christian texts against Christians. You talk about, Jewish tricks. Talk about Jewish tricks where you obfuscate the entire Bible, you obfuscate this and that. We still have not come up with an argument for morality that you seek to impose. You seem to have problems with things that the church fathers have done or hypocrisies, and yet no standard by which to say that they're
wrong. All right, guys, let's move on.
Original ad hominem doesn't work. You resort to, it's
not an ad hominem. It's not an ad hominem. It's simply to say that I simply don't understand. A personal attack would be like your hair is dumb. But I'm saying
the entire basis of your religion cannot be objective. You don't even know its history. You don't even understand.
Of course we do. Of course we understand the historicity. Look, I'm sure you pulled all these arguments from the Zeitgeist film.
Aquinas living 1,000 years ago didn't even know the Dead Sea Scrolls existed. Why do his arguments make that much sense? He didn't.
Irrelevant.
All right, guys. Hey, let's move on. Let's move on. Because you guys fundamentally disagree, and that's not going to change. But all three of us have in common is the good old U.S. of A. Nick, why is Christianity essential to the future of the United States?
Sure. Well, I mean, it's pretty simple. If we want to be a moral nation, if we want to have a nation that makes sense again, we have to embrace Christianity. And look at the threats that we are under fire from. We're under fire from moral relativism, from the cultural Marxists. We're under assault. They say that gender doesn't exist. They say that, the sexuality is doesn't mean anything. It's all fluid. It's all this and that. Marriage is under fire. The family is under fire. And look, you can mount consequentialist arguments against those assaults. And you could say, well, here's why we can demonstrate pragmatically why families are better and men should be men and women should be women and X, Y, and Z. We could attempt to do that, but all of it will ultimately fall flat because there's no authority in those arguments. You look at what is being undermined in the United States, and it's the very foundation of why we're here. It's a very foundation of the nature of degrees to get into a Thomistic argument. But fundamentally, look at what we're at assault at. It's not just immigration. It's not just, tax policy. It's an assault on what it means to be a man, what it means to be a woman, what it means to be a nation. And how are we going to carry that out if we don't have strong families? And the only institution that can answer that authoritatively is the church. You may be able to answer that with a report from the Heritage Foundation or a personal belief, but you cannot say that this is the truth indisputably like Christians can. So in that way, it is completely indispensable in the restoration of the country.
Styx.
All right, not to delve into an atheistic argument, but I can literally claim objective truth on virtually any spiritual statement that I make as long as no negative can be proven. Look, pagans had the nuclear family, the concept of morality, the tribal, the proto-nation state / nation state mentality long before Christianity exists. Pagans, thousands of years beforehand, managed to run stable cultures that lasted sometimes thousands of years uninterrupted. They didn't have, they weren't screwing everything that moved, other than the Greeks, generally speaking. They had that problem. They weren't screwing everything that moved. They had a nuclear family, especially in Northern European groups. They had virtually everything that Nick is talking about wanting. Why then should Christianity, unless you, again, are making that, hey, it's just the objective truth argument that I don't have to take seriously. Unless you are making that claim, why wouldn't paganism do just as good a job? And some of these pagan cultures, by the way, they lasted so long, they lasted longer than any of the Christian empires so far. I think, isn't the United States approaching the point at which will be the longest lasting? And we were formed by deists, and we're falling away from that sort of a hyper-Christian mentality anyway.
Lots of claims being made, But again, the argument is that there is no way that you can authoritatively say that one mode of living is better than the other. And you could say, well, I'm objectively true in this and that. And you could say, well, because we believe in the thunder god, or, whatever your deity is, your pagan deity. The fact of the matter is people do not believe in them. There is not theology behind this. There is not historicity behind this. To draw this false equivalence between Christendom, which you have, again, thousands of years, the scholarship that has been done, and people have believed, and there is a heritage of this in this country. To speak simply on pragmatic grounds, who do you think can come and convince people that they are objectively correct about the family? Somebody who says, hello, Americans, I am a Christian, and the Christianity says this, that, and the other, and this is true. Or somebody who says, hello, I praise Odin. I am here with the hammer, and I say that the pagan family is back. And additionally, you conveniently leave out the point where the Roman Empire, as successful as it was, it had infanticide. It had gladiator fights. It had horrible injustices that were being committed. Even the charity that was being done during Roman times was not done for the sake of, well, we should help each other out and we should have real community. It was done because, well, I want to showcase my liberality and maybe I want a debt paid later. So again, to this false equivalence that's drawn between paganism and Christianity, it can only exist in this abstract universe, absent the practicality, absent the reality of the situation.
Again, that is a subjective claim. I would point out that the Roman Empire persisted in such practices well into the Christian period. They continued to enslave and butcher people. It was a politicized religion. Catholicism was born literally out of the political Romanization of primordial Christendom. That's fine. That's all well and good. What I'm saying is that there's no more objective basis of that, and simply saying, well, people will be taken more seriously if they say we're going to restore our nation with Christianity.
All right.
I don't know. Number one, it probably depends on who you actually talk to. And number two, that's a bandwagon fallacy. Who cares? China, it's very fashionable in China to be a spiritualist or a Buddhist or to just be a hardline atheist. That doesn't make one of those paths right.
Well, Styx, I would ask you.
If narrow is the way that leads to heaven, why does it matter if it's a popularity contest?
Well, I didn't say it would be a popularity contest. I said if we're talking about restoring morals and you saying, well, how is your objective thing better than the other? If we're talking purely in terms of a consequentialist lens, that would give you more credibility. But we believe it because it's the truth. I would ask you, if you're talking about pagan religions, which are interchangeable, can you give me an example of a pagan religion which could restore traditional values in the country, which has a convincing theology, a convincing metaphysics that we could start preaching? Is there one that...
Considering the similarity of holidays and the similarity of imagery and practice, virtually any of them from Northern Europe. Of course, you could have Norse.
So which one?
Norse paganism would be fine. Anglo-Saxon paganism. What I would say, though, this is what I've been saying. I wouldn't even want to use them as that objective method. We're getting, I think, hooked up here a little bit on the concept that there has to even be an objective measure for that morality. I am simply saying it's okay for people to be spiritual, including Christian. By the way, I don't fear Christians. I don't, as you think, hate Christianity in a general sense. What I am saying is that Christianity has shown itself, its track record in the last few hundred years is towards the same decadence and decay that you see in the culture. It's not the absence of Christianity that's causing it any more than the presence. It is simply the fact that Christians are capable of being corrupted the same way because your God does not objectively exist.
But aren't you moving the goalposts a little bit? I mean,
No.
you started out by saying, well, what makes your religion? If we're going to establish an objective morality, then anyone can, but I don't even care about it. And then you just followed up by saying, well, but I don't even care about it.
That's because that's the claim that you made. So I was just responding to your claim of objectivity. Well, this is the one objective.
Well, and you answered, and by the way, you answered with the religion. But you answered it with, does Norse mythology, riddle me this, my friend.
If you ask a question, I'm going to answer it. Yeah, it's the way it works.
Norse mythology, does this have a convincing metaphysics? Can you metaphysically demonstrate the existence of tribal Norse gods? Where's the proof for that, as opposed to the proofs that have been laid out by Christian apologists for thousands of years?
There's Christian apologists have laid out proof that is convincing to people that are Christians and not convincing to people that aren't, or everyone would be a Christian. The Muslims literally claim the same friggin' thing.
You yourself said you didn't read the apologists.
Same thing.
You yourself said, wait, they create an apologism that isn't convincing to non-Christians. And you yourself said, not only have you not read the premier apologist, but you don't care what he wrote. So that's kind of an interesting
I am saying that the entire world would have converted by now because of the fervor of Christian missionary activity.
Not if they don't read.
Objectively convincing.
Not if they don't read.
Objectively, it's convincing, yes.
Okay, great. Guys, we're moving on.
That's like saying that if I read spiritual, no, I've got to answer this.
Okay.
I could claim the same objectivity and say, well, a lot of people became occultists and theosophists and all these related new age sort of groups in the eugenics period, including a great many Christians that became a bunch of mystics. I'm not sure whether many Christians realize that their great-grandparents probably practiced black magic. That certainly happened, not just in the US, but in Europe. That doesn't make the arguments objective, and it doesn't make it true. You could even use the same bandwagon appeal. Became a bunch of Christian mystics, hundreds of millions of people.
I'm not making the bandwagon argument. That was one argument that was made, but the fact remains that, again, you shift the goalpost. First, you say there is no objective. You make a false equivalency between paganism and Christianity, of which there's no. I asked you, is there a convincing metaphysics? Is there anything comparable to Christianity? And you twist it on a dime and completely avoid it, because the answer is no. And here's the difference between Christianity and other religions. Christ was prophesized. There were 456 prophecies for Christ. If God was going to send a savior, he would tell us he was coming, and he did almost 500 times. And Christ affirmed all of those things. And we had 2,000 years of Christendom. We have a metaphysical foundation, a convincing one that has not so far been refuted. And you say, well, how is that any different than the cult of Mithras or the cult of Horus, of which none of these things exist for those religions? So it just strikes me as just disingenuous that you would draw any kind of convincing parallel between the two.
They're parallel because those prophecies that you're referring to also, in many cases, not always, but in many cases, overlap with other religious figures too. You could talk about Krishna. Horus would be one. Krishna is probably the closest you could think of. That doesn't make them real. It doesn't make them real figures. In many cases, Christians look at the Bible and say, well, that part is a metaphor. This part's symbolic in some way. It's the rock is actually Peter. Well, okay. How do you come around at that actual conclusion? There are Christians who disagree with you. But I mean, at this point, we're just splitting hairs a little bit.
No. That's two different things. The difference that distinguishes Christ from others. Well, because you started out by saying, well, there were other prophecies and that doesn't matter. And then you got into, and anyways, people have this literal versus figurative interpretation, which is a separate argument. To address the first point,
the interpretation for pragmatic purposes.
Okay, but these are two different arguments.
We're talking about we're having two slightly different conversations at this point, it seems. On the one hand, we're arguing theology. On another, we're arguing the application of that theology in a pragmatic sense. What I am saying, for the political purpose of a state, it doesn't particularly matter which religion is used. Gear it towards pragmatism. Where exactly would the difference be in morality between Christians and pagans? Why were the pagans able to thus be moral even by Christian standards? Meanwhile, the early Christians in some of those middle-aged kingdoms were slaughtering people. They practiced infanticide, cannibalism at times, incest. They had orgies. There were popes that had orgies. Sure. I think it was the Joust of the Whores, if I remember correctly, if indeed that tale is true. What I'm saying is that it is in spite of that religious belief system that all of these things still can occur. Installing Christianity as a sort of state religion isn't going to change that.
Well, nobody's talking about that. But in the first place, you seem to be really running away from the prophecies, because this is really where it falls apart, where there is no equivalent to Christianity. No, I didn't say this. Wait, I didn't say this proves Christ. I said this proves why Christ is exceptional, why this religion is exceptional when compared with others, pagans, Eastern religions. This is why it's exceptional, because there is documented in ancient texts these prophecies that the Savior of mankind would have X, Y, and Z, that he would be born in Nazareth, he would be born in a manger, X, Y, and Z. There's 456 of these, and that's why we study him. That's why he's exceptional.
And that makes sense in propping up.
Wait! Come on, my guy. I'll let you finish. I'll let you finish.
Props up your theology.
And
that story.
And then you argue, and then your argument is, oh well, you say that what? Because Christians were bad, that is the same as saying that it doesn't matter if there is an objective moral right and wrong, which is a very big difference. Hey, listen. Again, you have this big problem with interrupting. I didn't interrupt you. The problem is this. What you have during the Middle Ages, even when you had popes who were doing orgies, even when you had Christians who were doing bad things, here's the difference. Christian doctrine said this is wrong, and that's the big difference. This is a difference that matters. Pagans, they may have by accident lived up to Christian standards, but there was no rule saying this.
Oh, yes, there was.
This is objectively not one that was built upon the same foundation that Christianity is. And so to say, and maybe they said it was, maybe it didn't, but the point is that you have an objective morality and it be based on the one true religion. But beside the point, it's very different to say Christians were misbehaving than to say that Christian doctrine is not true or not important. The reason that you can say that Catholic bishops were wrong, and by the way, the scandal in the Catholic Church, the rate of abuse in the Catholic Church is equal or lower than rates of abuse in other institutions in the world. That's a fact. But number two, to even use the vocabulary to say that those things were wrong, you have to have an objective standard of right and wrong. Otherwise, you're just saying, well, I find it personally distasteful, and you just have a personal problem with it. But the thing is that we Catholics or Christians can say, well, they did something wrong, and there will be a punishment for them, because regardless of what fallible men do, the doctrine is the same, and it's protected from error. So again, these are like rookie mistakes all over the board.
That was believed in by the pagans as well. You keep going back to the idea of, well, I'm right because I say so. I'm right because Aquinas said so 1,000 years ago. That is a subjective argument. You can point to prophecies, which I dispute. You can point to abuse rates, which I dispute. That doesn't really matter, though. It ultimately doesn't matter. Ultimately, you can't even come around to one single interpretation of the doctrine.
Sure we can.
Yes, there are protections. There are absolutely protections against things like infanticide and rape within paganism. Absolutely. It's not some fluff bunny.
Yo, Nick, chill out. Nick, Styx will finish. Styx is going to finish, and then we're going to move on to the next question.
Where were you when he was interrupting me, big guy?
Dude, you both get like 3 or 4 minutes each.
All right,
you know what I mean? You guys got plenty of time.
So
dude, come on. All right, so Styx, close this out, and then we'll move on to the next question.
We can go on to the next question.
All right, cool. Styx, is the United States a Christian country? Should it remain so?
It was founded as a deistic, secularized Christian nation, and it should remain that way, yes.
Nick?
It doesn't matter, to follow up, it doesn't matter if paganism becomes some sort of state religion either. It's got to be secularized at the state level.
It's just simply not true. I have to laugh when people say that America is not a Christian nation. And you have to define, well, what is a nation? I think if you're abiding by the interpretation that a nation's rhetoric is what a nation is, then I think there's a good argument you could make that the rhetoric of the American founding, or maybe the basis of the American political economy, was built on deistic, albeit Christian-inspired deistic principles. But if we define a nation as the composition of the nation, which is its people and its institutions, the nation at the founding was Christian. Maybe in the Declaration of Independence, they said by our Creator instead of the Christian God explicitly, and maybe they didn't make reference to it in the rhetoric of the founding documents, but the nation was nearly 100% Christian, nearly 100% They occupied religious institutions. The church was a big part of the settlement. I mean, look at the first founders at Plymouth in the 17th century. I mean, who were these people but religious separatists, but people who went to form a Puritan religious community? So the idea that America was never a Christian country is just a laughable argument. It's one that you have to stretch and you have to bend the interpretation. You have to play with the language. And I get where the deistic argument comes from. Again, it comes from, Ben Franklin and Thomas Jefferson, who said he was a primitive Christian, even though they opened up the constitutional conventions with Christian prayers, et cetera, et cetera. These are minor details. You can make that argument maybe. But the composition of the country, the nation is its people. The people were Christian. The institutions were Christian.
Styx, do you have a response?
I would say that as a follow-up to that, one can pray to the Christian God, hold them to be even self-evident without believing in the concept of the establishment of a organized religion. That is, the founders differ from you in the sense that you believe that a central authority is needed to mete out spirituality. Largely, they refuted this argument in the most directive terms. Not just Ben Franklin and Thomas Jefferson. You would have been hard-pressed, I think, to find many of them who are religious to the point of wanting to subjugate themselves. In many cases, people came specifically to this hemisphere to get away from that concept. I would also point out as a historical note, Roanoke actually comes first and was not established for religious reasons.
Okay, but again, you are not answering you fell right into the fallacy that I laid out, which is you can argue that, well, the framers weren't devout Christians. Okay, yeah, and you can make that argument, but that does not change the fact. Okay, but that does not, you could say organized religion is Catholicism, but Christianity is organized religion. They went to church. Okay?
Religion
and they
is
were
not
Christian,
the same
and the people were devout. What's that?
Religion and theism are two separate things. So is spirituality. I'm spiritual.
Let me ask you this.
I'm atheistic, but I'm not religious.
Let me ask you this. Were the 97% of the Americans at the time of the first census in 1790, the 97% who identified as Protestant Christian, were they deists or were they Protestant Christians?
The many were deists, especially those who were part of that literate Enlightenment mentality.
That's just simply not true.
Absolutely true.
That is simply contrary.
I can read books that they wrote.
All right.
I edit them.
And you can look where they prayed. Why would they pray to a God that they didn't think mattered?
I could pray to God right now. It doesn't mean I'm a member of some Christian congregation.
Prayer? Interesting.
You could pray right now and never go to church.
You guys fundamentally disagree on this, but again, USA.
I think everybody knows that it's
USA, right?
bogus.
It's
common ground, USA, right? I just pointed there. And this is a relevant question to a lot of things going on today. We'll start with Nick on this one. Are Christians being discriminated against in the United States?
Of course they are. Of course they are. You look at any kind of push by the left, whether it was gay marriage, whether it's gun control. Look at the people that comprise the NRA. It's white Christian men. I mean, you look at any of the assaults by abortion, on and on, the transgender stuff. Most of it amounts to an attack on Christianity. And this goes back a long time, by the way, when they tried to get God out of the schools, when they tried to get God out of the curriculum, and they got God out of television. Of course, they're under assault. I mean, these are the people that are made fun of. These are the people that are laughed at. How many different cartoons and things where they attack Christians? And you could say they attack others, but I mean, the others were not the founders of the country. The others were not represented in the country. So of course they are. They're not afforded the same special treatment as Jews or Muslims or Sikhs or anybody else. Of course. And I think Styx might agree with that.
Yeah, I would actually agree with him on this one. Christians have been maltreated recently, especially. I would go further and say other groups have been as well, but I don't want to see Christians censored. I don't want to see Christians mistreated. And I think
our guy.
Yeah, at this point, the nation has become more and more abusive towards anyone with what might be seen of as yesteryear's morality, like traditionalist in the 50s sense, especially. So Christians take the brunt of that.
All right, great.
Something we can agree on.
Yeah, it's awesome. We all have common ground in the US of A. That's what I figured. You guys disagree so much, but we do have this common ground. Speaking of which,
we can talk with each other.
Exactly.
I enjoy it. Yeah, absolutely.
It's crazy fun. I've been hosting this thing, but I've been just like this the whole time. Like, wow, this is unreal. I'm learning so much, and it's just so much fun. Anyways, Styx, in your ideal America, what role does Christianity play with our leaders?
They can be as Christian as they want to. I just don't want them legislating from a sense of objective morality. This would, by the way, extend to paganism. They can be pagan, but I don't want them telling me how to run my own paganism or my own occultism. It shouldn't be the place of the state. The founders understood that would corrupt religion. Christianity, the easiest way to destroy Christendom is to politicize it, to make it a sort of state religion and expect people at the top to be part of it. We've been there, we've done that, it didn't work.
Nick.
Well, it's not to, because that's a whole can of worms in and of itself. But to answer the question, I would say that I think Christianity should inform the values and the decisions made by public officials, in the sense that the Constitution was written, whether you can argue that it was deistic or not, or the founders were deistic or not, the Constitution was written in the context and upon the shoulders of 1,000 years of Christendom and Christian culture and things that were uniquely Christian. And so I think that for starters, for any kind of public official or public servant to be acting in parallel with the founding documents or the values of the country, I think they would have to be Christian. That's number one. But then number two, I think we can ask ourselves very plainly, would we prefer that the country be governed by Christians or by atheists, by Christians or by Muslims or by pagans, where they have different beliefs? I think most people, maybe homosexuals and transgenders and people who want an abortion, would be would dissent from this. But I think, because I think that those kinds of people wouldn't want Christians in power. But I think everybody else would say probably it'd be better.
I don't know. I think they might want the Pope in power at this point.
Nah. You think he's your guy, but he hasn't really made not
my guy. I openly
substantive change. Well, I mean, you know what I mean. When he does these kinds of outreaches about these different issues, he hasn't really changed anything substantive yet.
All right. Before we enter the fourth quarter of the world's #1 Chadcast, we're going to have to hit the super chat a little bit. Randy Williams, I love you. I want you to know that. I think you're great for these donations. He basically answered his own question. He said there is no doubt as it pertains to Christianity. Thank you, Randy. So Sigmund T. Washington. Nick, why does the Catholic Church not recognize Mormon baptism?
I don't know. I don't know why they don't. Probably because I think they see Mormonism as heretical, right? I mean, even if you're baptized in another Christian denomination, you have to go through a process where you can have all the sacraments done to you in the Catholic Church. So on the particular Mormon question, I'm not versed in the Mormon theology. A couple of my viewers tried to turn me on to it, but I looked into it and I was like, nah, not really for me. But I believe that's true of other Protestant denominations, that they don't accept the baptism as well.
Awesome. Another quick one from Dana Kerr. So riddle me this. Abraham was asked to sacrifice Isaac just to test the faith of Abraham in Genesis. What says you?
Yeah, well, is this for me or is this for Styx?
Probably for you.
All right. Well, the point of that kind of a sacrifice, I think it gets to the larger question of God's love, which is a lot of people mistake this. They think that Christianity is kind of like this touchy-feely kind of a thing. But remember, when Christ came in the Gospels, he said that if you love your parents more than me, if you love your family more than me, if you love your children more than me, I don't want you. I will not remember your name when you enter my kingdom. I mean, this was said in the Gospel, that he wanted people who were committed to Christ, committed to God's love above all else. I mean, there was, I believe it was said in the Gospel, they wanted to go and bury the father, and they said, no, let the spiritually dead, take care of the spiritually dead. You're with me now. You're with Christ. So the point was to demonstrate that God's love is greater than our love. It supersedes our love for a spouse, for a child, for a father, for a mother. People might, think there's a problem with that, but what we're in love with is perfection. We're in love with divine beauty, justice, truth, intelligence, all these other things. So that was, I know people might have a problem with it in this day and age, but that was the point.
Okay, a quick one for Nick before we enter the fourth quarter. This is from So Based. Which Christian values, and Styx can answer this too,
Sure.
Which Christian values do you personally not agree with? Does total agreement imply subjectivity?
Well, Styx can go first on this one if he wants, but okay. I'll answer that.
I don't agree with the concept of turning the other cheek, as Jesus commanded. I believe that you should strike out back at your enemies and get revenge within reason. I mean, you don't commit genocide because someone stole your spoon or something like that.
Maybe you do.
Well, yeah, maybe. Depends on if it's a large country or not. No, but I would say that's probably the main one. The concept of forgiveness in a way to a fault, I would say, I don't believe in either. The concept, you would be like, oh, well, this person's like, they've hunted me down my whole life, they killed my whole family. Oh, I forgive them because of some, theological reason. I'm not sure that sits well with me.
All right.
Yeah. On the trouble of, or not the trouble, but on the question of Christian morals, I know a lot of people have a problem with this with politics. This is something I hear, or a refrain I hear a lot from moderates, which is, how can conservatives believe in everything conservative, or liberals everything that's liberal? Don't you diverge a little bit? And with Christianity, it's actually very different, because we believe, if you are a Christian, you believe that Christ was the Son of God, and therefore everything he said was true. Everything he said was perfect. And so you might disagree with something the Pope says or the clergy says, but you can't disagree with the magisterium. You can't disagree with what Christ said, because, and that's where faith comes in. People have this misconception about faith that we don't know that God exists. We just take this leap of belief, which is not supported. And faith is actually about, we know that God exists. And even when we don't understand his will, even when we don't understand the things he says, or we might personally disagree with it, we have to have faith that it is true, because we understand the reason that he exists. So I can't say I disagree with much. I can kind of get the turn the other cheek. There's other interpretations about that, but it's difficult, but we have to have faith.
All right. This is a good one from Night Valley. We'll start with Styx. Is faith and science equally important?
That one's a little bit more difficult to answer, actually. I would say science, generally speaking, is more important in the sense that if you don't have that technology in today's world, if you don't have technology, if you don't have advancement in the perhaps technological sense in general science, you're going to fall behind everybody else. It's really at that point you'd have to have a lot of faith to say, well, I'm just going to pray about it. Medicine. Who needs this? Who needs cars? I'll pray to Jesus to teleport me somewhere. Maybe Muhammad will get me there on his back. I think that faith certainly has a place in the world. I have no problem with people who have faith. It's just don't tread on others in the application of it. And if it stands in the way of science, sorry, but generally I'm going to favor science unless science is delving into the realm of morality. Like you would think maybe technologically speaking, maybe algorithmic censorship. Well, yeah, science can certainly do that, but should it? I think I'd rather listen to the average religious leader on the topic.
All right, Nick.
Yeah. I think that's kind of a misconception between science and faith. I think first and foremost, people have this conception of science, which is different from how the scholastics saw science, different than how the ancients saw science. Science today is physical science and empirical physical science, whereas before it comprised many different fields, of which theology, or rather metaphysics, was one of them. And it abided by logic, abided by rationality and reason. I mean, I bring up Aquinas, which is such a fine example, because he said, I'm not going to take it on superstition alone. I'm going to demonstrate it through reason that God exists. And I think actually the more that you look at science, the more you have a conviction in God. So I don't think the two are different. And here's something really interesting that I found in preparing, which maybe would convince unbelievers, which I thought was just fascinating. This really isn't an argument for God, but it is something peculiar, which is that this is the fine-tuning argument that Christians make, which I think is really something that if you look at, for example, the gravitational constant, if the constant, the gravitational constant, which defines gravity, was off by 1 in 10 to the 60th parts, life would be impossible. If the cosmological constant was off by 1 in 10 to the 120th parts, life would be impossible. And you get into these numbers so crazy where our universe shouldn't exist. And if it were purely contingent, I don't think you really make that argument, but it shouldn't exist by these calculations, and yet it does. So I think in many ways science complements faith. I think it's a false dichotomy to begin with.
I would point out briefly that isn't that the disappearing puddle argument, I believe it's called, where you're saying, well, this puddle is perfect for this particular fish and it's slowly shrinking, goes away, the fish goes away. If you weren't actually there, if there were a difference in the math that you're talking about, you wouldn't be there to witness the fact that you didn't exist. So it's kind of a flawed and illogical argument.
Well, I just think people say it's necessary, but I don't know why the universe should be necessary, but
all right.
But it could be a pantheon of gods. Maybe Odin created things.
Oh, yeah. It could be. Who knows? Yeah.
Okay, this one is before we enter the fourth quarter for the final 15 minutes like the NBA. This is America's number one Chadcast. What an episode. This is from the Dashing Rogue for Styx. What is Styx's thoughts on Nick Fuentes, a Wyatt man, art... I'm pronouncing that wrong, but art.
Oh, Nick Fuentes.
Yeah. Art in the use of it by the alt-right. For Nick, do you know about the ABRAXAS Foundation?
Oh,
No,
right.
I do not know about that foundation.
All right, Styx.
Yeah, can I explain? I can explain your part too. Abraxas refers to the ancient Gnostic deity. I believe the one above the actual demiurge, if I remember correctly, or maybe it's a different term. I'm rusty on my Gnostic. Nick Fuentes is actually, he has forsaken sort of his white nationalist beliefs and is now a Varg style, like pagan survivalist. He uses the pseudonym A. Wyatt Mann. He was actually a contemporary of Nicholas Schreck, was involved in his ear loss episode, as he's spoken of before. As far as I know, he's not a pagan in the religious sense. I've thought that his cartoons, they're well drawn. There was a funny time in which I thought Ben Garrison had actually unironically borrowed one of his tropes, actually had to get that sorted out. But I don't know anything further really about him, to tell the truth. I don't even know what his modern views are at this point.
All right. We'll start with Nick. Does the abandonment of religion in the United States lead to degeneracy?
Of course it does. I mean, and this can be argued simply on the consequentialist basis that if people are not subscribing to any moral I think one of the bigger problems in the country, to cede a little bit to Styx, is that there has been no alternative. In the absence of Christianity, there has been no replacement. And this was the problem that Nietzsche postulated, Dostoevsky commented on, Evola commented on, is that in the absence, and even Jung, in the absence of any ritual, spirituality, supernaturalism, anything like that, without any moral foundation, any rules, I think people just simply descend into hedonism. They descend into the pleasure principle. And so this is one of the problems with so many people is they're not brought up Christian, or they're not brought up in church or with any kind of convincing or strong Christianity. And what do they descend into? What is their directionality in their life? It's towards, I want to feel good. I want to feel a good high. I want to get drunk on the weekend. I want to smoke a joint. I want to have good sex. And this is their directedness. I would say that at the very least, if you had an alternative belief, this could be constructive. At least there would be a moral there. But now it's simply the absence. It's a vacuum. And so, of course, it necessarily leads to degeneracy when you have a moral code that there's expectations and there's community enforcement and there's all the rest and there's some kind of divine basis for it. And then now you have nothing. And what are the rules now? Of course, it's going to lead to degeneracy.
Styx.
I would say there's plenty of degeneration among individuals who have plenty of religious beliefs. There are also religious groups who have no problem with some of those things. I would say religion is not inherently bad for a culture. That's not what I've been arguing, just so everybody is aware of that fact. It's organized religion can be a problem in the sense of a church. Religion itself and the spiritual, the faith side of it, not a problem. Yes, it can cause the denigration of a culture, or the culture can degenerate even though it is present as well, as we've seen with the United States. Majority Christian nation begins to decline away from the old morality. Now, some parts of this I see not as degeneracy. I know me and Nick would disagree. I don't see the ending of the drug war as degeneration. I see that as a good thing. I see it as the restoration of how the country was on that issue beforehand.
Yeah.
I don't see necessarily like abortion. I don't see that as degenerate because it was happening even while illegal. I suppose the normalization of certain cultural modes can definitely be problematic if they harm the culture. We've certainly fallen into that on immigration. But again, it's primarily Christians, or at least Abrahamists, Christians and Jews, that are voting in favor of these things. They vote for politicians that are in favor of these things. One could say even against their own self-interest, but that's just the state of mankind.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you on the drug war issue. I really don't believe that past civilizations had the drug war. Past advanced civilizations, if they did exist, I really don't think they had the drug war, even if they were Christian.
Yeah, they have no problem with alcohol.
Right,
alcohol,
right.
Drug, absolutely.
Exactly. And it's like, which drugs are you talking about?
No.
We could get into this on another day. Because it's like the legal opiates, I'm telling you, Nick, the legal opiates are just as damaging as the illegal opiates.
I don't refute that. Pharmaceuticals are a big problem.
Right.
I agree with that.
Okay, cool. All right, so moving on. Is the Pope, this is for Styx to start, is the Pope a false idol in the United States?
No, he's just a fallible human being, a foreign dignitary who likes to stick his nose in our political business. He should keep his fucking nose out of our political business, and that's about all. He has no further meaning because I don't give the religion itself any mystical credence per se, beyond some, maybe practices. Prayer can be positive for a person, but then again, so can meditation a la Buddhism. But no, the Pope has no significance really to me. I just think he's a confused older gentleman who happens to be relatively wealthy and cared for, and he's not necessarily in touch, I think, at this point, even with the lay Catholics. Maybe at one point, no longer. He's sitting there up in the Vatican. He can make a big show about not wearing the ruby slippers and sitting in the gold throne. At the end of the day, though, he doesn't worry where his next meal is coming from, as maybe a few 100 million Catholics in Latin America or West Africa have the problem of.
Nick.
Well, can I answer that as well?
Absolutely.
Well, and specifically in the Catholic definition, an idol is what, if you believe a statue to be a god. That is the strict definition of an idol in Catholicism. And you can look this up. That's actually true. So people might point to the statue of the Virgin Mary. They might point to the Pope. They might point to other things. But defined by the church, only statues that you attribute some kind of divinity to, that's an idol. But on the question of the Pope, I think this is a good point that he brings up, because the papacy is one of the wealthiest institutions in the world. It's incalculable how much wealth that they have. But I think it's important to understand the context of that wealth, in the sense that, where does most of their wealth derive from? It derives from land, and how they've accumulated land over the course of 2,000 years, and accumulated land that has appreciated in value considerably, because that land obviously was worth a lot less when Western Europe was like a third world in the 4th or the 5th century than it is now. And then additionally, look at the artifacts historically that they have that you simply can't put a value on. And then beyond that, I would point to a biblical justification for this, where Jesus Christ, he has his feet washed with perfume, and somebody objected to it. And he said, well, no, that's okay. I'm here now. You can save that for the poor later. But then number two, I think it's important to understand how much charity is done by Christians and by the church in particular. I think it was in 2017, it was $30 billion that was spent by the Catholic Church just in the United States in terms of charity. The top 5 charity organizations I believe it's in the world. Yeah, in the entire world, that's a different figure. In the entire world, the top 5 charity organizations by expenditure are all Christian. In the top 10, it's 7 of the top 10. So I think it's important, the church is very wealthy, Christians are wealthy, but there is a tremendous amount of charity going on.
All right. And this is kind of a mix, a question for Styx about Nick. Now, Styx, do you think Nick is a hedonist? It's a funny. So one time Cernovich called Nick a hedonist, and I thought it was the funniest thing ever. It was so funny. So that's what that's from. Do you have a take on that or no?
I wouldn't say that by my standards I don't know enough about his personal life to make that snap judgment. I'm assuming by my standards probably not, just lives normal life, you wear your suit, whatever. By your own Savior's standards, however, you live a life that in the modern sense is considerably more wealthy than even more of the greater nobility that would have lived in his life. Maybe he would have wanted you to sell some of what you own and give to the poor. Again, that's by his words, but he also had a problem with anyone having, it seems, ownership at all and not living a migratory lifestyle, or at least that's how you can interpret it.
All right.
Well, I would say that we're all sinners. I mean, that's kind of the point. Jesus Christ said he didn't come to save the people who thought they were righteous, but the people who knew they were sinners. And so you can't point to a single person who isn't, in contrast with God as flesh, is not a sinner. And I would say on the question of being migratory and selling all your belongings, Jesus liked to speak in hyperbole. I mean, this is not disputed by biblical scholars. I mean, he said things like, if you're sinning with your right hand, cut off your right hand, because it's better that you go into heaven without your right hand than to be dragged to hell with it. And I don't think anybody would say that he really meant cut off your limbs, poke out your eyes, do all this crazy stuff. And even with the turn the other cheek business, that was also speaking in hyperbole. He was saying generally you should be pacific, generally you should be more peaceful, but not, there were crusades, there were all kinds of other things. Jesus told his followers, sell your cloak and buy a sword. So I think Jesus tended to speak in hyperboles, and this is demonstrated by the church.
Right. I would maybe disagree with that. If someone's capable of walking on water and turning a couple loaves of bread into enough to feed thousands of people, I don't think that they need to be hyperbolic at that point. I think it might have been, Nick, meant to be taken literally.
All right, Styx, this one is, we'll start with you on this one. Would you prefer to see a Christian majority in the United States or a Muslim majority in the United States? Yeah, it's kind of obvious. Everybody you'd go with Christian, right?
Wait. Was this question for Nick?
No, this is to start with you.
I would rather see a Christian majority, of course.
Okay,
That's
cool.
because Christianity has had longer to mature and get past being zealous and fanatic. Most Christians aren't fanatics.
Okay. Speaking of which, this one will start with you, Nick. If Styx repented and was baptized in the icy waters of Lake Winnipesaukee, would he be accepted by Christ into heaven's gates?
Of course, unless he's blasphemed the Holy Spirit, he can be saved. Everyone can be saved, and that's what we're trying to do. Styx, we want to save you. We want to see you reunited with your Holy Father. And I'm joking a little bit now, but it's true. I mean, everybody can be saved. That's the beauty of our religion, is that all sins can be forgiven. If you are remorseful about them and you believe in Jesus Christ, anybody can make it through. It's difficult. Now, it is a difficult thing. That is what he says. But if you ask for forgiveness, it's given. I mean, once you recognize that we live under divine wrath, you realize what a beautiful thing divine mercy is. That here we are bugs, and yet we get to make it. We're all going to make it, lads.
Awesome. In the words of Saruman, save your pity and your mercy. I have no use for it.
Oh, wow. He went there. Okay, great. This is from the Dashing Rogue, and I got another beneath that I'll get to. I'm not forgetting about you. To Nick and Styx, does might make right? If so, does Nick and Styx believe in natural law and natural rights? Styx, we'll start with you.
Is that Styx or me?
Yeah, Styx. We'll start with Styx.
Okay. I would say might makes right in the pragmatic sense, because if you have the ability to do something, you have the ability to do something. It's just that simple. As for whether it is moral, whether it is ethical, I would say the basic concept of the NAP is that you have these different competing poles of power, essentially. You're not trying to stomp on someone else's feet. Do whatever you want, but don't harm other people. It's also a pagan element as well. It's quite literally. If you look at might is right, I know it links up with Satanism, but the original text has more in common with pagan lore, literally Norse lore as well. And if you look at it that way, certainly you have the right to do what you are able to do, but at the same time, other people will try to do it to you. Maybe it's better to have a polite society with some degree of order in it.
Well, it's just interesting. It's just interesting to me when, and this is not a dig. I'm not trying to be rude about it, but when you talk about rights, it's just very hard for me to pin that down, because again, you said there's no objective right and wrong. But to answer the question on does might make right, of course it doesn't. Of course it does in the Christian tradition. We hold that if somebody is murdered by somebody, even if they were stronger, even if they were able to impose their will, they achieved their will to power, well, they still did a wrong thing if it was an unjust killing. And so of course it doesn't. What's right is what's laid out in the good book. So and that's the thing, we actually believe in right, unlike others. There's no other. Might is just might, and who cares about right and wrong if you don't believe in God?
You were about to say that there was no other justification for such a system, I think. Other religions think the same thing.
Well, but I mean, again, that's different between being a religious person and being apatheist, or saying it doesn't matter, it's kind of irrelevant, right?
Apatheism is not your religion.
Okay, but point being that you can say, well, Muslims believe that they're right and they have a moral system which they think is objectively true. But if everybody took the position that you're taking of this kind of paganism, and it's everybody has their own and everybody has their own morals, everybody has this individuated spirituality, it's kind of hard to talk about what is morality. If it could be everything and nothing, it's not even really a useful expression.
I'm saying that the state should set that up in a secular way, enforced by laws and by the force of the state.
Who establishes the state?
Who establishes the church?
Oh, wow.
Well, believers, but that's the thing. I mean, if
people who make up the state establish the state. There you go. People
who drink blood establish the state. I mean, that would be a problem for you, not for us, because
Christians, yeah,
we're gonna put them out. Okay, that's a nice little blasphemy. Where the gates are closing, Styx.
All right. Okay, this is a question from Totally Not Troll. Awesome name. Why should we get Polish Pope again, and how can he help us reclaim Constantinople?
Who's that one to?
Let's start with you.
Well, it'll be difficult. I mean, we just have to pray. We have to pray that the church finds some wisdom and appoints somebody who is right for the time. we don't know God's plan. We don't know God's will. So we don't know. I don't think we have the authority to say whether Francis is bad or not. Maybe we could disagree with what he says politically, but to make an ultimate conclusion about it, I think is a little bit premature. But I do pray. I think that we need to have somebody in there who understands the threat that we face to Christendom, to the faith, not only in the form of the Muslim world, which is what everybody talks about, but from within Christendom, which are, these people, the religious leaders, and they're always out there pushing doubt and doing all these kinds of things, making us doubt our religion, doubt our Savior, like maybe they did a couple thousand years ago. So we need a Pope who understands the threats that we face both externally and internally. Got to pray for it. Hopefully the Cardinals make a good call next time.
I would like to point something out.
Yep.
People back during the Middle Ages and Renaissance used to pray when the great horde of Muslims were trying to invade on all fronts then. Prayers didn't do anything, but people like Vlad the Impaler, Charles Martel, Charles the Hammer, managed to repeatedly slam the Muslim armies. And they were not themselves, although they professed Christendom in the most extreme sense, they were not themselves very good at following their own religion. Vlad had multiple concubines, apparently knocked one of them up at one point and gutted her and had her impaled because of this fact. Charles Martel loved to drink and womanize. All of these different people did, and yet they were very effective at safeguarding not only European culture, but Christendom itself. The center of Christendom was saved by a bunch of people who might be considered totally irreligious and lapsed. They didn't have time to go to church.
Maybe in part, but of course the siege of Vienna in 1683 was repelled not by Vlad the Impaler, it was repelled by the Poles, and thank God for the Poles. But I don't know if that's disproves anything. I mean, people can do this kind of really edgy, prayers don't do anything, and we saw a lot of this with the shooting. And this was a favorite of Christopher Hitchens, but I mean, I think you say meditation matters. I mean, don't you believe that intentionality matters? Don't you think that an expression of intentionality in the universe, I mean, you are a spiritualist, don't you believe that can change the outcome of events, or no?
Yeah, of course. Prayer is not a negative thing. I'm not saying that. I'm simply saying that its larger pragmatic effect upon world politics, upon hoping, we hope that, this time around the Islamic horde that's moving into Europe or something will be repulsed because we want to save Christendom. Praying about it won't do anything. The Pope, least of all, is going to do anything about it. What needs to happen is action. More is accomplished on your feet with your hands than on your knees with your words.
Yeah, and we're praying for, that's really, did you get that from like being atheist on Facebook? But look,
it has nothing to do with atheism.
The point is, you know what the point is. Look, when we pray, it's to say that, we're over here in the United States and we pray that the cardinals will have the wisdom, or we pray that the Pope has the wisdom to do the right thing, because of course he has tremendous power, and we pray that he has the wisdom to exercise it effectively. We're not saying don't go out there and don't repel the invasion, don't elect leaders that will repel this, don't fight them where they are. We're simply saying that on the question of how can we get a Pope, this is something that's out of our control. So we should pray that they have the wisdom. And you again, walk this line where prayer doesn't mean anything. It's not a bad thing. And I'm a spiritualist, but at the same time, incantation means nothing. On your knees, we need to go and fight them where they are. But I mean, sometimes all you can do is pray, and that's good.
All right, quick one for Styx. If you had to choose between Lutheran and Catholic, which would you choose?
Neither.
Okay. I knew that would be a quick one.
I suppose probably Catholicism at that point.
Oh,
okay, yeah. He's coming around. Oh no, what's going on, you guys?
I'm bringing him over.
The power of Christ compels you.
Yeah. So, okay, for Fuentes, the 10 Commandments state not to kill. Do soldiers go to hell? Do drone pilots go to hell for the civilians killed on their order?
Good question. Good question. And this is actually addressed in the gospel, where Jesus Christ says that a military man was a good person. So we know that, Pontius Pilate was said to be a good person. He was given his orders from above, as they say. And that's when he absolved himself of responsibility for the crucifixion. He washed his hands of it. And certainly I believe that Jesus Christ would say that Pontius Pilate was a moral person, somebody who would be saved. So no. And remember, again, it's about killing. It's not about, or rather murdering, not about killing. I think there's a distinction between just and unjust. There were killings throughout the Old Testament, and there were killings done by the church in the Crusades and the Inquisitions, not to the same extent that you see violence from secularists or others, but there were. So I don't think it's you have to be a Quaker and you have to be a pacifist, but I think that was what was interpreted in the Bible.
Styx, do you have a comment on that?
In paganism, being strong is considered a good thing, and going to war is a really easy way to actually uplift yourself spiritually. If you are a good soldier, not a coward, not like gutting women and children, doing crazy things like that. If you're willing to go on the battlefield and be brave, especially for a higher spiritual purpose, yeah, it's perfectly justified.
Okay.
I would say many wars are unjust, but I'm not going to blame the soldiers. They just follow an order.
Okay. This is from the Dashing Rogue to Styx and Nick. What are your thoughts on the cult of Mithras? We'll start with Styx first.
Just another group of pagans.
Okay. And what are your thoughts on Caesar's Messiah by Joseph Atwill?
Never read it.
Nick, do you have any comment on that?
Yeah, I've never read that either. And in regards to Mithras, yeah, it's just the same. If the contention is about, like pagan influences on Christianity, again, I would posit that if you look at the complexity of the Christ figure, and you could certainly make the case that a lot of the stories, flood stories, like in Noah's Ark and all that, the Garden of Eden, you can trace a lot of these stories. There are antecedents to it in Sumeria and Babylon. There's stories like this all around the world. Every civilization has a flood story. That's a good example, Gilgamesh and all the rest. But the Christ story is unique. The Trinity is unique. The resurrection, in particular Christian terms, there is no antecedent for this in paganism. Maybe there's resurrections, maybe there's saviors, but not in the same way, not in the complexity, not in the differences where they count of Christ.
That's not true. You've got Bacchus among others. That very
tell me,
literally having his blood drunk in the sense of symbolically with wine, having a birthday solstice and everything else. It's like historians. By the way, it was funny you pointed out that some OT work that was based on paganism, I guess. I would think that would undermine the New Testament because the Old Testament is its foundation, but we'll get past that.
But is that, wait, but on the question of Christ, I mean, tell me about this pagan antecedent. Was there a Trinity? Was he God become man? Was he also God and also
did
man?
Have a female counterpart, although it was not a Trinity.
Okay. So this is not anything Christ-like.
It is. It's not. We're not saying that the Jesus of your historical revisionism is based on any single pagan path. It's an amalgamation of many because Rome was an amalgamation of many. It's not just Mithras. It's not just Bacchus. It's not just Greek and Roman paganism. All of these things were fused already into the Roman religion. They simply adapted it further. If there was a historical Jesus, that person's life has been transmogrified beyond all recall by the Christians.
There is no comparable figure to Christ. Maybe you could pick out.
Matter.
You pick out, but there's nothing new under the sun. But I mean, the Christ figure and the complexity and in the distinctions that are made by the Catholic Church, there is simply, for the kind of theology that we're talking about, it was so ahead of its time in terms of Trinity, in terms of duality, in terms of all the things that we see, that this man who stumbled to the throne, a God who stumbled to the throne, inaugurated his reign with this ignominious defeat, crucified, but then conquering death. I mean, there's simply no equal. I mean, you can point to, well, there's a little here, there's a little there, but nothing like Jesus Christ.
Krishna is very similar.
No.
Okay, guys, we got one more quick super chat, and then we'll do closing statements, and we'll close out. This is from David Morris. This is for Styx. Could you elaborate on how the end of organized religion can help more spiritually focused Christians like me?
Yes, what I would say is this. If a person spends all their time listening to other people's interpretation of a religious dogma, they may not take the time to study it for themselves. And if they believe in the concept of being led spiritually at all, I would urge you to simply just assume that you're going to be spiritually led by encountering that material. Judge it for yourself. You are just as intelligent as any of these religious leaders. In many cases, you're probably going to be more intelligent. Some of these people are nothing more than zealots. This has been the case throughout human history. Religions have been politicized, and in some cases, you're going to, depending on the nation that you're in especially, depending on what religion it is, it may be that you're practicing a religion that you're not even getting the original dogma for the most part. You're worshiping, in essence, a state-style religion, some form of animism that's been co-opted by a tribal warlord, some variant of Buddhism that's been transformed or reimagined by some communist regime or something. It doesn't pay to do that. If you believe that your eternal soul, especially, is at risk, I would think that you would want to branch out beyond listening to a rabbi or a cleric or something.
Okay, two quick ones. Okay, sorry, Nick, go ahead.
Yeah, well, I just, yeah, briefly, I think the beautiful thing about Christianity is free will. You're invited to become a Christian, and to say that, regular lay people know better about Christianity, I just think that is something that I thought maybe for a long time considered, but it's just simply not true. And I think, especially if you look at when literacy was almost nearly lost in Western Europe, but it was preserved by the monks, nobody would make the case that the lay people are more intelligent or well-read than the monks to really understand the Bible. You look at the priests, the pastors, the bishops, the cardinals, and they've had years of schooling and training, not just on theology, but on philosophy. They've read Aristotle, they've read Plato, they've read Aquinas, they've read the greatest philosophers. They understand reason in a scientific sense, metaphysics in a scientific sense. They've read the Catechism. I mean, things you wouldn't believe. And so you can, we have free will to decide we want to be Christian and hop on board, but then there is this authority, and thank God for this authority that we have people who have dedicated their lives to this rigorous study of fundamentally the most important issues. So I would just push back a little bit on that.
Some Christians believe in predestination, however.
Yeah, and they're not a part of the church.
Okay. A $20 super chat just came in. People are getting them in at the last minute. We love it. We appreciate you guys. So thank you so much for watching. This is for Nick real quick. We got like 3 or 4 more quick ones. But this is just, there's so much value in this. I'm probably going to rewatch this 6 or 7 times. Even though I stuttered like 30 times, I was just so much going on, so many thoughts, just it's unreal. Okay, Nick, would you agree? Honor thy mother and father, but love your pagan past.
Well, here's the thing that we have to understand about our religion and the way we justify it. The pagan ancestors of, the Christendom and all of that, there is value in that. I mean, Christians don't hold that let's just throw it all away, let's just set it on fire. I mean, even something like, I think there's a really good example that's used by Archbishop Fulton Sheen, where he demonstrates that if the truth is like a circle, if the truth is 360 degrees and every degree is getting closer to it, Aristotle and Plato and Socrates, they might have gotten 180 degrees, and maybe Hinduism has gotten 230 degrees, and so that's not, it's to say that there is truth in a lot of things. There is truth in a lot of things. I think we see glimmers of it in a lot of things, but Christianity is the way. So honor your father and mother and love your heritage, love where you came from. This is where I think there's a strong case to be made for traditionalism and nationalism, that we love our parents in the way that we should love our nations and the way the nation should love the church. It's all just it's a love fest over here. So definitely, I think there's a lot to be learned from those peoples.
But they're in hell.
Yeah, they are in limbo.
Yeah.
They're in the first circle, having a good time.
All right. And this is to Styx, real quick. I'm not a Christian, but if we get rid of Christianity, it will create a vacuum. What are your thoughts on that?
I don't want to get rid of Christianity. I simply don't want it to become a state religion that imparts objective morality, so-called.
Okay. And Nick, this is for you. What is Nick's opinion on Styx seeing Stolas? Do you believe him? And do you think it's a good thing?
What's seeing Stolas?
I don't know, Paul.
Stolas is a demon. It's a little bit complicated. I don't believe in demons the way you do, but I use that name because this is the overlapping figure, essentially.
It's no good. You got to be careful. You've got to be careful, Styx. Look.
No, I consider Stolas a friendly entity. I don't believe in demons. I believe in the original term daimon, which can mean any spirit, essentially.
Here, Satan comes in many forms, big guy.
He's welcome. We can have a drink of wine.
Yeah, well, I think
with Satan.
My thoughts on Styx, he's got to be careful with the occult stuff. Satan is out there. And I'm not even doing this to be a caricature. I believe evil exists in the world. Satan is the progenitor of it, and we have to be very careful not to be deceived by him. We can't allow him to separate us from our spiritual father. But he doesn't see it as a demon.
Yeah,
that's his worldview.
I think that evil comes from people being naturally having corrupt tendencies. It's essentially, the way I explain it is very rationalistic. Evolution gave us certain traits that we now call things like greed and lust. They're no longer useful to us. They're vestigial, but they're still there.
All right. This is from Dana. So riddle me this. Abraham was asked to oh shit, that's the other one. She sent 2. Okay, here's that. Sorry, Dana, this is your second one. When did Christians decide the Bible was finished? Why are only old texts accepted? If a dude said God sent him, who decides what is valid now? I guess that's for Nick.
Yeah, well, it was the Council of Nicaea. They decided which books would be in the Bible. And what was the second part of the question about why would they not allow new books to be added?
Basically, yeah.
I don't, I mean, doesn't that seem kind of preposterous? If you have a gospel, if you have an account of the biography of Jesus Christ, I mean, why would they let, like, for example, Joseph Smith contribute to that, you know, or somebody else? And the people who put together the Bible, the Council of Nicaea, these were learned people. I mean, the people that contributed to the construction of the Bible were people who, you know, they were intimate with the text. They were intimate with what needed to be said. I mean, you can read, there's just volumes and volumes and volumes of the early church fathers and what they had to say about it. So it's important at some point to say, this is what a Christian is, this is what it isn't.
All right.
And I would just like, as a follow-up, each successive religious group says that theirs is the last one that will be added.
Okay.
They're all wrong.
The Jews
They're
are
all
like,
wrong.
"Oh, these are our holy books." The Christians have, well, we've got a few more. The Muslims say, well, those are kind of inspired. We get a few more. Mormonism says, well, here's our new book. It's like the Desert Trilogy meme. I hate to bring that up because it's usually paired with, you know, Fedora. But it is kind of true. Yeah.
Disagree, but.
Okay, this is a question. I think it pertains to Salem, Massachusetts. This is the last super chat. How many witches died in the burning times? Styx, do you know this one?
It's not entirely clear because there were comprehensive records for certain events, but we don't necessarily know about them all. It could have been quite a few tens of thousands.
Okay, closing statements. You guys, thank you for being here. Thank you for joining me on the Chadcast for this unbelievable conversation. Nick, do you have any final words for the viewers, for us all?
Yeah, I suppose my final words would be that to distinguish between the deontological and the consequential. We believe in Christ not from the consequentialist lens of we would be better off, we would be wealthier, we would be more powerful, things would be better in the temporal world. In consequence, we believe deontologically in God because it is good, because it is the truth. And so I would say that anybody who wants to get on board with this because they want to find passages or rhetoric or, you know, talking points that they can use to justify a political agenda, I would say that's not the reason to join the faith. The reason we join the faith is because we believe that God exists. He is the unmoved mover, the unchanged changer, et cetera, as Aquinas defined it. There is intentionality, there is design in the way things are, how things are. You can see the handiwork of God all around you, and that Jesus Christ was his son, and he came and he died for our sins, and what he said was true. And I would just challenge people. I think the one takeaway would be maybe a reading list, because it's a 2-hour debate. We've done a good job. Styx did a good job. I did my best defending the points here. But really, I mean, these are very complicated issues that people have debated on for thousands of years. And so I would just encourage everybody who's interested in the subject to read Aquinas, to read Feser, to read Augustine, and just really interrogate these arguments, because I do believe that there is a real problem that people in this day and age, they don't hear the right justifications for Christianity. They hear Paley, they hear this churchianity type stuff. You got to go back to the roots. So if anybody could take away anything, it'd be read Aquinas, read up on the subject. We want you in the church, but you're going to come around by your own free will. But thanks for having me, and thanks, Styx, for a great debate. It was really fun. It was civil, and you're a smart guy, so it was a blast.
Awesome. Nick, you are welcome on this Chadcast any day of the week. I want you to know that. I watch America First probably 3 or 4 days or 3 or 4 nights per week. I'm in the chat, you guys. I'm in the chat. Styx, final thoughts.
I would just say, first, it's been an absolute pleasure to be here. And Nick, great debate. You did a great job. I like your material a lot. So it was interesting because, you know, we can be intellectual and talk about these things. I think it's a testament to the need for free speech on the internet. Just my mandatory anti-censorship comment here, because otherwise we can't have these sorts of debates. True. So definitely it's a good thing. I would say on the spiritual topic, the United States was already a Christian nation for most of its existence, yet it managed to somehow fall into decadence prior to actually losing that religiosity. This has happened before. It's not because of Christendom. I've never said that, but it paired up with that. I would say be very, very careful about people who boil down, here's the solution to all of our problems as a society, to something as simple as, well, we'll pray. Well, we'll have a certain church. I don't think that it will work. I think if we look at history, which we both pointed to in our debate here, I think if we look at history, that's absolutely not true. And a reading list is actually a really good way to close this, I think. In addition to, you should absolutely read Aquinas. You should absolutely read the Bible, too. And I've encouraged people, regardless of my own religious beliefs, to do so. It's still a spiritually significant work. I would say as well, you should read Dower's work, specifically Occultism for Beginners. You can see some of the same arguments that are made by Christians, including yourself, Nick, really on the topic of the physical or natural world, the reflection of that being God, being the correct faith, the correct path within spirituality. You should definitely read Aryan Sun Myths if you want to get a greater grasp than I can myself personally explain in a single debate on the topic of Jesus actually literally being adapted from past savior figures within certain groups within paganism. I would say the Epic of Gilgamesh is probably a good place to also begin your reading research. But again, I had a great time, and thanks for having me aboard. I'd love to be back sometime.
Absolutely. Styx, you're welcome on this Chadcast anytime. It's called Call Me Al. We're Tuesdays at 9 p.m. We're going to do special events, weekends. We're going to do live events. Really excited for your new projects. And that's it, right? That's it. We're wrapping up. Unbelievable. What a show. Oh, I'm going to rewatch this 3 or 4 times. You guys should watch every single episode. We're only on episode 11. That was episode 11. So we got
dubs.
Yeah. Yeah. So we got huge plans. Subscribe to this channel, like this video. What'd you think about that debate, man? That was
epic, man.
Yeah.
Really glad you guys came on board. Appreciate it. I'm gonna dig into some Aquinas and Augustine, right?
Yes. Good. Excellent.
All right, man. Thanks, guys.
All right, guys.
Thanks so much.
Take care, fellas.
Peace out.